Hello everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The mysterious logging operation. In the dusty expanse of rural New Mexico, where the horizon stretches endlessly across canvas of red rock and sagebrush, my grandfather Dale lived a life of honest labor. He was the kind of man who could fix anything with his weathered hands, whether it was a broken engine that had given up hope, electrical wiring that had lost its way, or a stubborn piece of ranch equipment that refused to cooperate. Our family had carved out a living doing the work that others turned away from. The jobs that required strong backs and an unwavering willingness to get dirty under the relentless desert sun. That particular summer started like any other, with the heat shimmering off the asphalt and the wind carrying the scent of creosote across the valley. But then something extraordinary happened that would change everything. A logging company appeared overnight, like a ghostly apparition materializing from the desert air itself. The strange thing was, there wasn't much forest to speak of in our area, just scattered patches of scrub oak and the occasional stand of pinon pine that hardly seemed worth the effort of industrial logging equipment. Dale, ever curious and never one to pass up good work, applied to be a truck driver for this mysterious company. To his complete surprise, they hired him on the spot, along with several other locals, to fill what they called swing shifts. The company arrived with an impressive fleet of shiny new equipment and a crew of men who seemed to know their business with military precision. But there was something unsettling about the entire operation that made Dale's skin crawl with unease. The work schedule was unlike anything he had ever encountered. They operated 24 hours a day in relentless rotation, and the company planned to be in the area for only 1 week. The pay was incredibly high, almost suspiciously so, but the hours were irregular and the atmosphere was thick with tension that seemed to permeate every conversation and every glance between the workers. Each night, Dale would return home utterly exhausted, his eyes sunken deep into his weathered face, and his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something darker and more troubled. He began telling stories of the logging camp, of the men who worked there with clockwork efficiency, and of strange occurrences that happened in the dead of night when the desert was supposed to be silent and still. Even as a young child, I could sense the deep unease in his voice, the feeling that something malevolent was waiting just beyond the edge of our small town, watching and waiting with infinite patience. As the days passed with agonizing slowness, Dale's stories grew increasingly ominous and sinister. He spoke in hushed tones of strange noises echoing through the sparse woods, of lights flickering mysteriously in the darkness where no light should have been, and of an unshakable feeling that unseen eyes were constantly trained upon him and his fellow workers. My grandfather wasn't one to spin elaborate tales for entertainment, so when he spoke of these things with genuine fear in his voice, I knew something was genuinely wrong. The men he worked alongside were unlike any loggers he had ever encountered. They all wore identical high and tight haircuts, pressed black suits that seemed entirely impractical for manual labor, and carried themselves with the bearing of military personnel trying unsuccessfully to blend into civilian work. Every single piece of equipment was brand new and freshly oiled, from the massive trucks to the tree pushers, none of it showing any signs of previous use. The vehicles all bore temporary paper license plates with identical numbers and letters, lacking proper expiration dates, as if they existed outside normal bureaucratic systems. The loading zone was entirely private and surrounded by tall barbed wire fences that reminded Dale uncomfortably of military installations he had seen in old war movies. Armed guards walked regular patrols around the perimeter, and jeeps conducted constant surveillance laps around the entire facility, ready to respond instantly to any sign of trouble or unauthorized intrusion. The hired local drivers were strictly forbidden from entering any area beyond the truck stalls outside the main fence, creating an atmosphere of secrecy that felt oppressive and unnatural. During their nighttime drives to the processing facility, which was located approximately 2 hours west in the direction of Chaco Canyon, Dale and his fellow drivers began witnessing phenomena that defied rational explanation. Every single night without fail, after they had traveled well outside the borders of their small community into areas where sparse woodlands dotted the valley floor, brilliant lights would begin appearing in the distance. These weren't ordinary lights, but impossibly bright white orbs that seemed to contain the concentrated brilliance of captured sunlight. The lights would dance around each other in complex patterns, engaging in what appeared to be elaborate games of chase, before seeming to blink coded messages toward the convoy of trucks below. They would zip through the trees with impossible speed and agility, interrupted occasionally by the forest canopy, but always returning with renewed intensity. When the convoy reached its destination, the lights would suddenly shoot upward into the night sky, one after another, until the woods returned to their natural darkness and stillness. Even more disturbing were the figures that appeared along the highways during these midnight runs. Well-dressed individuals in business suits and ties would stand motionless beside the road at 2 a.m, some carrying briefcases as if they were commuting to important meetings in the middle of the desert. They never attempted to flag down the trucks or ask for rides, but simply watched the procession of vehicles pass by with expressions that ranged from blank indifference to apparent joy and satisfaction, and occasionally what appeared to be genuine shock or amazement. The processing facility itself was built into the side of a mountain, accessed through a massive bay door that would roll open to allow the trucks to drive directly underground into what the workers claimed was an old converted mine. But Dale couldn't recall any mining operations in that particular part of the valley, and the underground facility was far more extensive than any mine he could have imagined. The tunnels stretched in every direction, with roadways as wide as 80 feet and ceilings that soared to heights of 100 feet or more, creating a vast subterranean network that seemed to extend to impossible depths beneath the desert floor. The trucks themselves bore no identifying markings whatsoever, which violated numerous transportation regulations that Dale was familiar with from his years of driving experience. They were completely devoid of company names, unit numbers, length specifications, or serial numbers that were legally required on commercial vehicles. The only marking on any of the equipment was a strange circular symbol stamped near the corner of each trailer's back door, resembling some sort of ancient religious or Masonic emblem that none of the drivers had ever seen before. When the week finally ended and the mysterious logging operation vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, Dale was left with more questions than answers and memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He and his fellow drivers would spend the next 20 years meeting in local bars and back shops, usually over beer and whiskey, trying to piece together theories about what they had witnessed during those 7 surreal nights in the New Mexico desert. My grandfather took those secrets with him to his grave, never knowing for certain what cargo he had transported through the darkness, or what purpose those brilliant dancing lights had served in the vast conspiracy that had briefly touched our small corner of the world, leaving behind only questions and the lingering feeling that some mysteries are perhaps better left unsolved. Story 2. The Desert Convoy. The year was 2009, and I found myself deep in enemy territory in an undisclosed region of American conflict in the Middle East. As an 88 Mike, a truck driver in the Army, my days blended together in an endless haze of choking dust, diesel fumes that burned the throat, and the constant underlying threat of sudden death that hung over every mission like a suffocating blanket. The desert landscape stretched out before our convoy like an endless grave, punctuated only by the occasional forward operating base that served as tiny oases of relative safety in a sea of chaotic uncertainty. Our extraction mission had taken us to one of the most isolated bases in the network, a facility that sat alone and vulnerable, far removed from the protective umbrella of larger installations. We had just finished loading everything valuable from this remote outpost, stripping it down to its bare bones, and leaving behind only the essential infrastructure that couldn't be transported. The mission was to break down the base systematically, taking all useful equipment and leaving nothing behind that could benefit insurgent forces, who would inevitably move in once we departed. The route we were taking wound dangerously through a series of different outposts, many of which had already been abandoned in the gradual withdrawal of forces from the region. Security along this particular stretch of road was inconsistent at best, creating a tactical situation that shifted unpredictably from day to day. Every time the sun disappeared behind the horizon, it was as if someone had completely rearranged the chessboard of conflict. A stretch of road that had been relatively safe during daylight hours could be littered with improvised explosive devices by the following morning, creating a deadly game of chance that we were forced to play with our lives as the stakes. Our convoy departed from a base that was barely managing to hold its defensive perimeter, its walls breached in multiple places and its defenses worn dangerously thin by months of constant harassment from enemy forces. We were headed for an airfield that was strategically positioned between two combat outposts, a location that was supposed to represent a safe haven but felt more like another potential trap in the endless maze of desert warfare. The past few days had been a relentless blur of chaos and violence, with constant barrages of insurgent attacks and mortar fire raining down upon our positions like deadly hail from an angry sky. Our departure had been deliberately delayed as a tactical maneuver designed to throw off enemy scheduling and surveillance, forcing us to linger for several additional hours while fine-tuning our vehicles and attempting to calm our nerves, which were stretched as tight as over-tensioned guitar strings, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. When we finally formed up and began moving, the 3-hour drive ahead of us felt like a journey through the valley of death itself. The treacherous terrain constantly shifted between small villages and townships before giving way to endless sand dunes that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The landscape moved and changed like a massive snake slithering through the desert, creating an environment where nothing remained constant, except the ever-present danger that lurked behind every rock formation and within every cluster of buildings. Crowds of local civilians gathered to watch our departure, their faces presenting a confusing mixture of curiosity and barely concealed hostility that made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. We knew with uncomfortable certainty that approximately half of these observers were undercover enemies, carefully positioned to relay detailed information about our movements, vehicle numbers, and timing to insurgent networks that would use this intelligence to plan devastating ambushes along our route. As our convoy began its slow progression through this hostile territory, the tension became almost unbearable. Every soldier scanned the horizon constantly with eagle-sharp attention, while every ear strained to detect the slightest hint of approaching danger. We moved like a giant target painted across the desert landscape, a slow-moving mechanical snake winding its way through terrain that seemed designed specifically for ambush tactics. I gripped the steering wheel of my heavily laden truck with such intensity that my knuckles turned white with strain, my heart racing like a frightened jackrabbit as we navigated through this deadly obstacle course. The villages gradually disappeared behind us, replaced by open desert where the sun beat down mercilessly like the attention of a malevolent deity. Every rock formation, every sand dune, every cluster of scraggly desert vegetation seemed to conceal potential threats, and I felt as though I was driving through an active minefield, where each mile represented another opportunity for catastrophic explosion. The radio crackled constantly with static and the voices of my fellow soldiers, providing a steady stream of communication that served as both reassurance and reminder of how precarious our situation truly was. Despite this technological lifeline to my comrades, I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that hostile eyes were tracking our movement from concealed positions somewhere in the vast emptiness that surrounded us on all sides. The air itself seemed thick with anticipation and malevolent energy, vibrating with tension that made every breath feel labored and difficult. We all understood with crystal clarity that we were sitting ducks in this exposed terrain, a slow-moving formation of targets just waiting to be picked off by enemies who had chosen their moment and position with deadly precision. When the explosion finally came, it shattered the oppressive silence like a thunderclap, filling my windshield with dust and debris while flames curled menacingly around the hood of my truck. The blast mixed catastrophically with my vehicle's combustion engine, effectively destroying all the mechanical systems that kept the truck operational. The catastrophic popping and hissing of all 4 tires as they succumbed to the intense heat created a symphony of destruction that marked the end of our vehicle's usefulness and the beginning of a desperate struggle for survival in hostile territory. Story 3: The Northern Michigan Encounter. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan stretched out before me like an endless wilderness of towering pines and hidden dangers as I navigated my 26-foot box truck through the remote state routes that connected one isolated destination to another. I was working for a company that specialized in delivering and installing complex machinery, and the back of my truck was loaded with 12 expensive pieces of equipment that represented both my cargo and my responsibility to complete this mission successfully, despite the mechanical problems that had been plaguing my vehicle throughout the day. Earlier that morning, I had taken the truck to the rental company for a thorough inspection, hoping to address the various issues that had been developing during my journey. The mechanics had assured me with confidence that everything was functioning properly and that I was cleared to continue with my delivery schedule. But their assessment proved to be overly optimistic, as problems continued to manifest throughout the day. By the time evening arrived, I found myself running significantly behind schedule due to the combination of mechanical difficulties and complications with the installation process at my previous stop. Rather than delay my mission further by stopping for the night, I made the decision to drive late into the evening hours to reach my next destination and get back on track with my delivery timeline. It was approximately 11 o'clock at night when I found myself traveling along a particularly isolated state route that wound through the heart of the Upper Peninsula's wilderness. The road was completely devoid of street lighting, creating an environment where the headlights of my truck provided the only illumination, cutting through the absolute darkness that surrounded me on all sides. There were no other vehicles visible in either direction, no signs of human habitation, and no indication that civilization existed anywhere within hundreds of miles of my current position. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming and deeply unsettling, creating a psychological pressure that seemed to intensify with each passing mile. I was experiencing the peak sensation of being completely alone in the middle of an extremely vast wilderness, and this feeling was entirely accurate given the remote nature of my location and the complete absence of any other human presence in the area. Without any warning whatsoever, every single light on the dashboard of my truck suddenly illuminated simultaneously, creating a Christmas tree effect of warning indicators before the engine simply died completely. The truck coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the road, leaving me stranded in pitch-black darkness, with only the rhythmic clicking of my hazard lights to break the oppressive silence that seemed to press in around me from all directions. Rather than waste precious battery power attempting to restart an engine that clearly wasn't going to respond, I made the practical decision to shut down all systems and began making phone calls to arrange for emergency assistance. I sat in the driver's seat surrounded by darkness, with the intermittent flashing of my hazard lights providing the only source of illumination in an otherwise completely black world. As I waited for someone to answer my calls, I noticed movement in the area just beyond the reach of my flashing lights. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of tired eyes and an overactive imagination, but the movement became more pronounced and deliberate as I continued to observe. When I finally managed to reach a mechanic on the phone, he informed me that it would take at least 2 to 3 hours for someone to drive out to my remote location, leaving me stranded, alone in the darkness for an extended period. The movement in the shadows became increasingly obvious and concerning as I sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic clicking of my hazard lights while staring out into the void of wilderness that surrounded my disabled vehicle. When I saw the same shadowy figures moving again, I made the decision to turn on my headlights with high beams to investigate what was lurking just beyond my normal vision. The powerful beams immediately revealed 3 large wolves that were feeding on what appeared to be fresh roadkill approximately 50 feet from my truck. When I honked my horn to announce my presence, the wolves looked up from their meal and regarded me with expressions that seemed more irritated than frightened, as if I was the intruder in their territory rather than the other way around. While I knew that wolves were generally unlikely to attack a human inside a vehicle, their presence added an additional layer of unease to an already stressful situation. I settled in to wait for assistance, periodically turning on my headlights to check on the wolves, who remained in the same general area throughout my vigil. Each time I illuminated the area, they were still there, sometimes feeding, sometimes simply watching my vehicle with the patient attention of predators who understood that time was on their side. The isolation was profound and psychologically challenging. I was surrounded by nothing but endless wilderness, towering trees that seemed to stretch infinitely upward, and the knowledge that the nearest human habitation was many miles away in any direction. The only sounds were the clicking of my hazard lights and the occasional distant noises of the forest that seemed to emphasize rather than diminish the overwhelming sense of solitude. Suddenly, the night was shattered by what could only be described as a woman's scream of absolute terror. A sound so primal and horrifying that it seemed to freeze the very air around my truck. The scream appeared to originate from directly behind my vehicle, close enough that it felt as though the source was standing just outside my rear doors. Before I could fully process this terrifying sound, something massive slammed into the side of my truck with tremendous force, causing the entire vehicle to rock violently on its suspension. This wasn't a gentle bump or accidental contact, but a deliberate impact delivered with enough power to move a heavy truck loaded with equipment. The force was sufficient to throw me around inside the cab, demonstrating the incredible strength of whatever had chosen to attack my vehicle. Story 4. The Icy Hill Descent. The late 1990s found me working for a company that owned and operated one of the most impressive pieces of earth-moving equipment I had ever encountered. A massive Caterpillar D9 bulldozer that weighed over 100,000 pounds when fully loaded with fuel and attachments. This mechanical beast was a testament to engineering excellence, capable of moving mountains of earth and rock with the ease of a child playing in a sandbox. But it wasn't commonly moved off the company property due to the logistical challenges involved in transporting such an enormous piece of machinery. However, the company had invested in the necessary equipment to move the bulldozer when special circumstances required it. Their transportation solution consisted of a 1980S International tractor paired with a specialized drop trailer, both of which had been purchased specifically for the purpose of hauling the massive dozer from one job site to another. Both the tractor and trailer had seen much better days during their years of service, showing the wear and tear that comes from decades of hard use and demanding conditions. But they remained functional and as safe as could reasonably be expected given their age and the demanding nature of their work. The tractor had accumulated several 100,000 miles on its odometer, which wasn't particularly unusual for commercial vehicles of its vintage, but every one of those miles represented hours of stress on mechanical systems that were already showing their age. While the vehicle remained roadworthy and capable of performing its intended function, it required careful attention and respect for its limitations, particularly when hauling loads that pushed the boundaries of its design specifications. We hadn't utilized the bulldozer to its full potential for quite some time, leading the company owner to make the decision to lend it to one of his business partners who had a project that could benefit from its capabilities. As someone who had been hired primarily to operate earth-moving equipment, with truck driving experience serving as an additional valuable skill, I was selected to handle the delivery of this expensive piece of machinery to its temporary new home. The process of loading the massive bulldozer onto the trailer was a careful and methodical operation that required precise positioning and multiple safety checks to ensure that the enormous weight was properly distributed and securely fastened. We used heavy-duty chains and specialized equipment to secure the dozer to the trailer, creating multiple redundant safety systems designed to prevent any possibility of the load shifting during transport. With the bulldozer properly secured and all safety protocols completed, I began my journey along state routes that would take me through a variety of terrain and weather conditions. The CB radio antenna hadn't been professionally tuned in several years, limiting my communication range and forcing me to deal with significant static that made it difficult to clearly understand radio transmissions from other drivers. Weather conditions were challenging, but not unprecedented for the season, with cold temperatures, light snowfall, and reports of ice formation on road surfaces in certain areas. I had properly displayed the required oversized load banners on the bulldozer to alert other drivers to the presence of my unusually wide and heavy cargo, and I began the journey with confidence in my abilities and equipment. One particular intersection along my route was notorious among local drivers for being especially dangerous under the best of conditions. The intersection was positioned at the base of a steep hill, creating a situation where drivers approaching from the elevated side couldn't see the traffic light or any stopped vehicles until they crested the peak of the hill and began their descent toward the intersection below. Under normal circumstances, this design flaw in the road layout was manageable because drivers typically had sufficient distance and time to safely stop their vehicles after gaining visual contact with the intersection. However, these normal circumstances assume dry road conditions, properly functioning brakes, and vehicles of standard weight and size. As I approached this problematic intersection, my CB radio suddenly came alive with the sound of a driver frantically screaming warnings to other traffic about dangerous conditions at the base of the hill. Unfortunately, due to the poor reception quality of my poorly tuned antenna, I was only able to understand approximately every third word of his urgent message, making it impossible to fully comprehend the specific nature of the emergency he was describing. Despite the incomplete information, I instinctively let off the accelerator as I approached the crest of the hill, partly because I was familiar with the intersection's reputation for being dangerous, and partly because I had developed a healthy respect for the area through years of driving experience. Under normal circumstances, this precautionary reduction in speed would have provided me with adequate time and distance to safely stop my vehicle regardless of traffic conditions at the intersection below. However, when I finally reached the peak of the hill and gained visual contact with the intersection, I discovered that traffic conditions were far from normal. A serious accident had occurred at the intersection only minutes before my arrival, and the resulting backup of vehicles extended more than halfway up the hill toward my position. Emergency services had not yet arrived at the scene, meaning there were no warning signs, flares, or traffic control measures to alert approaching drivers to the dangerous situation that awaited them. I immediately began the process of downshifting my transmission and applying my brakes, hoping to bring the massive weight of my truck and trailer to a safe stop before reaching the line of stopped vehicles. However, it quickly became apparent that the combination of my heavy load, the steep grade of the hill, and the increasingly icy road conditions was going to make stopping extremely difficult, if not impossible. As I applied more pressure to the brakes and continued downshifting to lower gears, I could feel the truck beginning to slide on patches of ice that had formed along the road surface. The tires began slipping and jerking the tractor around in ways that indicated I was rapidly losing the traction necessary to maintain control of my vehicle, and a terrible realization began to dawn on me that there might be no possible way to stop this enormous amount of weight under these treacherous conditions. The situation deteriorated rapidly as I heard the distinctive clanking sound of the fifth wheel connection point and felt the trailer beginning to tug at the tractor in an unusual and alarming manner that indicated the load was no longer following directly behind me as it should. Story 5. The Thing That Spoke with Mother's Voice. 11 years have passed since that December night in Iowa, but the memory remains as crisp and unsettling as fresh snow. I was a senior in high school then, living through one of those brutal Midwestern winters where the cold could kill you if you weren't careful. The kind of winter where the silence was so complete after a snowfall that you could hear your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. My best friend Colton and I were spending what we thought would be a boring winter evening in my family's walkout basement. The familiar sounds of video games filled the space while we waited for the night to pass. My mother had gone straight from work to meet her coworkers at the local bar, planning to unwind with a few drinks after another long day. She wouldn't be home for hours, which gave us teenagers the perfect opportunity for a little rebellion. The family wine collection beckoned to us from its corner cabinet, and we decided to live a little. As I was carefully extracting the first bottle, trying not to disturb the others, I heard the unmistakable sound of the garage door opening upstairs. The heavy wooden door creaked on its hinges before slamming shut with finality. My heart immediately began racing as I frantically searched for somewhere to hide the evidence of our intended mischief. "I thought you said your mom was supposed to be out all night," Colton said, his voice carrying a note of concern that matched my own sudden panic. "She was," I replied, my mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe she hadn't felt well. Maybe plans had changed. Maybe she'd forgotten something important at home. Heavy footsteps echoed from above, deliberate and measured as they moved across the hardwood floors. Then came my mother's voice, calling down to us with what seemed like casual familiarity. "Anyone home?" she yelled, her words carrying through the house with perfect clarity. "Yeah, we're just hanging out in the basement, Mom," I called back, still searching desperately for a hiding place for the wine bottle. The basement suddenly felt smaller, more confined, as if the walls were pressing in around us. More footsteps followed, moving from the garage door toward the staircase that led down to where we were hiding. "Hey, can you come help me with something? I need you up here," the voice called again. It was definitely my mother's voice, with all the familiar inflections and cadences I'd heard throughout my childhood. "Yeah, just give me a minute, Mom," I replied, finally finding a suitable hiding spot behind some stored holiday decorations. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity, maybe 20 seconds, that seemed to last 20 minutes. Then came the question that changed everything. "Anyone down there with you?" The voice carried a different tone now, more serious, more concerned. But there was something else, something indefinable that made the hair on my arms stand up. The voice sounded like my mother's, but it was missing some essential quality that I couldn't quite identify. It was as if someone had recorded her speaking and played it back through a slightly faulty speaker. Our family had always maintained an open-door policy. Friends and relatives came and went freely, and my parents had never been concerned about who might be visiting. The question itself wasn't unusual, but the way it was asked, with that strange underlying urgency, set off every alarm bell in my teenage brain. "It's just Colton," I yelled back, my voice betraying the unease that was beginning to build in my chest like gathering storm clouds. I finally located the wine bottle's hiding place and began walking toward the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The basement, which had always felt like a safe haven, now seemed oppressive and claustrophobic. As I climbed those familiar steps, I became acutely aware of the overwhelming silence that had settled over the house like a heavy blanket. When I reached the top of the stairs, I looked toward the garage door and then to the adjacent kitchen. What I saw, or rather, what I didn't see, stopped me cold. The entire area was consumed by absolute darkness. Every light was off, and no moonlight penetrated the windows. It was a darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. "Mom, where are you?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. The silence that greeted my question was deafening. No response came from the kitchen, the living room, or anywhere else in the house. The electric sensation of wrongness that had been building in my chest suddenly exploded into full-blown panic. Something was very, very wrong. My mother was not home. I ran back down the stairs, grabbing my coat as I went, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What's wrong, dude?" Colton asked, seeing the terror that must have been written across my face. "My mom's not home," I said as quickly as I could, frantically searching for my truck keys. "There's no one here. We need to leave. Now." "What do you mean?" Colton's confusion was evident. "You were just talking with her. I heard the whole conversation." "Dude, there's no one home. We need to leave now," I repeated, moving toward the back door that opened into our snow-covered yard. But then I saw them, my dog shaking uncontrollably on the couch, and my cat crouched behind the furniture, growling low and continuous. Their behavior confirmed what I already knew. Something was terribly wrong. "Are we leaving?" Colton asked, still trying to process what was happening. "No," I said, making a split-second decision that probably saved our lives. "I can't leave them here alone. Something is really off, though. I'm going to call my mom and figure this out." With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered immediately, her voice warm and familiar in a way that brought instant relief. "Hey, sweetie, what's going on?" she said, sounding perfectly normal and wonderfully real. "Mom, were you just home? I heard you yelling for me from upstairs, but when I went up there, you weren't here," I said, hoping against hope that this was all some elaborate prank or misunderstanding. "No, I'm just leaving the bar. I wasn't feeling very well. Are you okay?" "What do you mean you heard me?" Her concern was genuine, and I could hear the worry building in her voice as I explained the entire terrifying sequence of events. She rushed home immediately, but Colton and I stayed in the basement with the animals until she arrived. During those endless minutes of waiting, we could hear something moving upstairs. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or furniture being disturbed. It was something far more unsettling. A presence that seemed to create pressure changes in the air itself, like a black hole slowly moving from room to room. The word that instinctively came to mind to describe this presence was hungry. It felt like something vast and predatory, searching for sustenance of a kind I didn't want to contemplate. When my mother finally arrived home, we could feel the thing leave as quickly as it had come. The oppressive atmosphere lifted instantly, like a storm cloud dissipating in a sudden wind. The house returned to normal, filled once again with familiar sounds and comfortable energy. We never figured out what happened that night. My mother has since passed away, and I've moved to Arizona, far from those brutal Iowa winters. But whenever I return home and see Colton, we still talk about that night. He still gets visibly unsettled by the memory, and I know that whatever we encountered had perfectly mimicked my mother's voice while harboring intentions that were anything but maternal. Some things are better left unexplained, buried in the snow of memory where they can't hurt anyone else. Story 6. The Paperboy Who Heard Too Much. I used to deliver newspapers when I was 13, back when paper routes were still a thing, and kids would hustle through neighborhoods at dawn with heavy satchels slung across their shoulders. It was old-school work that taught responsibility and perseverance, the kind of job that built character whether you wanted it to or not. Rain or shine, snow or sleet, the papers had to be delivered. That was the unspoken rule that governed my early morning. Looking back, I think they hired kids for these routes precisely because we were easier to pressure into going out in terrible weather. Adults would have had the sense to stay home during blizzards, but 13-year-olds could be convinced that the paper absolutely had to reach every doorstep, no matter what nature had in store. That particular winter morning started like any other. I loaded my satchel with the day's papers and set out into the pre-dawn darkness, my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Winter deliveries were actually my favorite shifts because the world felt completely different at that hour. Everything was peaceful and still, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath before the day began. The houses I passed looked like something from a greeting card, cozy and warm with occasional wisps of smoke still escaping from chimneys. Streetlights cast dim yellow circles on the snowdrifts below, creating a series of small stages where winter performed its quiet magic. There was something nostalgic about those mornings, maybe because of the approaching holidays, or maybe just because of the way silence could make even ordinary suburban streets feel enchanted. But that morning was different from the start. As I walked my familiar route, stopping periodically between houses to catch my breath and survey the neighborhood, I felt an inexplicable unease building in my chest. Even now, decades later, I can't put my finger on exactly what was wrong. The streets looked the same, the houses were unchanged, but something in the air itself felt charged with potential danger. I pushed through the discomfort and continued my deliveries, determined to finish the route and get back to warmth and safety. The few early risers I glimpsed through windows looked normal enough, going about their morning routines with coffee cups and newspapers. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary on the surface. Shortly after passing a house at the end of a cul-de-sac, I heard two loud pops echoing through the morning air. The sounds were sharp and distinct, cutting through the muffled quiet of the snow-covered neighborhood. A minute later, a third pop followed, similar in tone and volume to the first two. Growing up around firearms had made me familiar with that particular sound, but my 13-year-old brain immediately sought more innocent explanations. It was much easier to believe that someone was having trouble starting their car in the cold and the exhaust was backfiring in protest. I'd seen it happen to my father's truck and other vehicles around town during harsh winter mornings. Backfiring was a common enough occurrence that it seemed like the most logical explanation. I continued my route, delivering papers to the remaining houses while trying to push the unsettling feeling from my mind. But the unease persisted, growing stronger with each step. When I finished my deliveries and returned home, I hesitated before telling my parents what I'd heard. There was something about the situation that felt too serious for a child to handle, too heavy for my young shoulders to bear. Finally, I mentioned the sounds to my parents, carefully describing what I'd heard and when. Their immediate response was reassuring and practical. It was probably just a car backfiring, they said, dismissing my concerns with the gentle authority that parents use to calm anxious children. These things happen all the time in winter. There's nothing to worry about. Their explanation put me at ease and confirmed what I desperately wanted to believe. I went about the rest of my day feeling lighter, convinced that my imagination had gotten the better of me in the pre-dawn darkness. But later that morning, everything changed. Police cars began arriving in our neighborhood, followed by news vans and clusters of uniformed officers. They centered their activity around the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the same area where I'd heard those mysterious sounds. The officials were asking neighbors if anyone had been around the area that morning, if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. My parents told me to stay inside, but even if they hadn't, I wouldn't have approached the authorities. The same instinct that had made me hesitate to tell my parents about the sounds now made me reluctant to speak with strangers. It felt wrong somehow, disrespectful and ominous, as if speaking about what I'd heard would make me complicit in something terrible. I didn't know every neighbor in our area, but the thought that any of them might be dead made my stomach turn. It was a heavy realization for a 13-year-old, that the paper boy might have been the first to know about a tragedy, the unwitting witness to something that would change lives forever. The full story emerged gradually over the following week, pieced together through police reports and neighborhood gossip. The man who lived in the house was older, a longtime local resident who had become a fixture in our community. He had a son serving in the army who had been away on deployment for an extended period. When the son finally came home to visit his father, he wasn't alone. He brought another soldier with him, a man who wasn't just a fellow serviceman, but his romantic partner. The son had chosen this visit as the moment to come out to his father, to introduce the man he loved and hoped to build a life with. No one knew the exact details of how that conversation went, but we all learned how it ended. The father, unable or unwilling to accept his son's truth, had taken a gun and killed both young men that morning. Then, in a final act of desperation or shame, he had turned the weapon on himself. I can only imagine how cold that visit must have been, and not just because of the half-foot of snow that covered the house and clogged the streets. The emotional climate inside that home must have been arctic, filled with disappointed expectations and generational misunderstanding. It was probably the morning the couple was planning to head back to base to return to a life where they could be themselves without fear or judgment. The tragedy impacted our entire community, but it affected me in ways I'm still processing decades later. I didn't deliver another paper for several weeks after that morning. Everyone was understanding about my reluctance. Even the newspaper editor showed compassion for a kid who had inadvertently become part of something so devastating. But for me, it became more than just a memory. It felt like I had been the fourth person in that room when it happened, an invisible witness to a family's destruction. The knowledge that I had heard those final moments, that I had been close enough to bear witness to such profound tragedy, created a quiet, suffocating trauma that has stayed with me throughout my life. The sounds I heard that morning, those 3 distinct pops that I so desperately wanted to believe were car trouble, were actually the last sounds 3 people would ever make. In my 13-year-old wisdom, I had chosen the most innocent explanation possible, but reality had other plans. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had trusted my instincts that morning, if I had acted on the unease I felt and called for help immediately. But I know that's not fair to my younger self. I was just a kid trying to make sense of adult problems with a child's understanding of the world. Be good to yourselves out there. Some mornings bring more than just newspapers to your door. Story 7. The Ferry Through Hell. Living on an island in Maine means accepting that your connection to the outside world depends entirely on the weather's mood. The ferry that links our small community to civilization runs only 3 days a week under normal conditions, and those conditions can change without warning. When winter storms roll in from the Atlantic, we become completely isolated, cut off from the mainland like castaways from another century. The boat ride itself is usually pleasant enough. About an hour of gorgeous coastal scenery and salt air that makes you understand why people choose island life despite its inconveniences. On clear days you can see for miles in every direction, watching seabirds dive for fish, while lighthouses stand sentinel on distant shores. It's the kind of peaceful journey that appears in tourism brochures and Stephen King novels, all quaint townships in mysterious depths. But for certain lifestyles, particularly those that require regular contact with the outside world, island living can become a prison. You'll learn to plan your life around the ferry schedule, to stock up on supplies before storms hit, and to accept that sometimes you simply can't leave when you want to. My best friend was having a bachelor party weekend that I absolutely could not miss. We'd been planning this celebration for months, the kind of epic debauchery that exists more in movies than real life. But that's exactly what made it so important. This was our chance to create memories that would last a lifetime, to celebrate friendship and freedom before responsibilities changed everything. The timing was challenging to say the least. It was Maine in the middle of January, with mountains of snow covering everything, and violent wind swells that made even experienced sailors nervous. My travel options were limited to the ferry and a small commuter plane, both of which seemed questionable given the weather conditions. When I checked the status of both services, however, they showed green across the board. Everything was operating normally, according to the official websites and phone confirmations. I loaded my bags into my car and carefully navigated the icy roads to the ferry terminal, paying the parking fee while harboring serious doubts about the wisdom of this journey. One look at the white-capped waves had me questioning whether I'd read the status information correctly. The ocean was churning with barely controlled fury, sending spray high into the air and creating conditions that looked more suitable for submarine travel than surface vessels. But the status boards confirmed what I'd been told. The ferry was running on schedule. I could actually see the ferry returning from its previous trip, rocking considerably on the roiling waters but somehow maintaining its course. The vessel appeared more stable than I'd expected, which helped calm my nerves slightly. When passengers began disembarking, I studied their faces carefully, looking for signs of distress or trauma that might indicate a difficult crossing. To my surprise, most of them seemed to be in good spirits. I didn't see any ghost white faces, bulging eyes, clenched fists, or signs of emotional disturbance. They appeared to be normal travelers who had survived their voyage without significant incident. This observation convinced me to proceed with my own crossing, despite the increasingly ominous conditions. Missing the bachelor party was simply not an option. I would rather drown in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean than let my friend down during such an important weekend. So I boarded the ferry the moment I was able, determined to reach the mainland regardless of what Mother Nature had in store. The journey began uneventfully enough. There weren't many passengers on board, just a handful of islanders heading to the mainland for various errands. Some were going to stock up on groceries and supplies. Others had appointments or events they couldn't postpone. We all settled in for what we hoped would be a routine crossing, making casual conversation and trying to ignore the increasingly dramatic movements of the vessel. As we moved away from the protected harbor and into open water, the ferry began tipping back and forth with growing intensity. At first it was just the normal motion you'd expect on a working boat, the kind of gentle rocking that can actually be soothing. But as we progressed further from shore, the movements became more pronounced and less predictable. The ferry would tip in one direction, causing everyone to unconsciously lean the opposite way to maintain their balance. Then it would rock back in the other direction with equal force, creating a nauseating rhythm that made casual conversation impossible. Through the viewing windows, we could see towering whitecaps colliding with our vessel, sending walls of water cascading over the sides. It was a complete whiteout in all directions. Land was nowhere to be seen, and we might as well have been sailing through an endless void of churning water and driving snow. The captain made an announcement over the intercom, his voice carrying the kind of forced calm that emergency responders use during disasters. "Things are rougher than normal out here," he said, "but everything is under control. I need everyone to stay calm, stay alert, and put your faith in me and my crew. For your safety, everyone needs to remain seated for the duration of the crossing." That last instruction deflated morale considerably. If the captain felt the need to keep everyone seated, it meant he expected conditions to get much worse before they got better. We watched through the windows as swells easily over 6 feet high crashed against the ferry, sending spray across the glass and reminding us just how small and vulnerable we were in the face of the ocean's power. We continued the nauseating back and forth motion for the rest of the crossing, each tip seeming to go a little further than the last. The waves tossed us in whatever direction pleased them, and we were completely at their mercy. During one particularly violent movement, the pressure from the water sent a huge crack running through one of the viewing windows. All the passengers seated near that window had to evacuate immediately, but they had to time their movements carefully with the rocking of the ship. The first people who tried to get up in a panic were thrown to the floor so hard it knocked the wind out of them. They learned to wait for the boat to tip the other way before bolting for different seats. The crack in the window continued to grow throughout the journey, though the glass never actually gave way. The crew tried to reassure us by explaining that it was tempered glass with double panes, strong enough to stop a low-caliber bullet. I looked at the ferocious ocean beyond that damaged window and couldn't help but laugh at their optimism. Who cared if it could stop a bullet when we were dealing with the entire Atlantic Ocean pressing against it? Looking back, I think the crew was probably just as frightened as we were and needed to tell themselves something comforting. The captain announced that we were running behind schedule but still making good time. Though no one really reacted to this news, we were all too busy trying not to vomit on each other from the relentless motion. I started to seriously doubt whether reaching the bachelor party was worth risking my life. Mother Nature seemed to be laughing at my presumption, reminding me that human plans mean nothing when the elements decide to flex their muscles. The boat rocked again, but this time it tipped so far that I had to put my foot against the wall next to me to prevent myself from falling. For a terrifying moment, the wall became the floor, and the floor became a wall. I was fortunate to be sitting alone. No one came crashing down on me from higher up the rows. If there had been any loose objects in the cabin, carts or luggage or anything not secured, it would have been like getting stoned to death every time the ferry shifted. We were inches away from being tossed right through those windows and into the frigid waters beyond. The glass would have shredded our bodies as we passed through it, and the ocean would have sucked us into the froth and debris before dragging us into raging currents. From there, the possibilities were all terrible. Drowning in water so cold it felt like ice cubes in your lungs, having every bone broken by the force of the waves, or simply freezing to death before any other fate could claim us. Fortunately, conditions began to clear after that near disaster. We couldn't have handled much more punishment, and I suspect the ferry couldn't have either. We made it to shore and docked successfully, and I even made my flight to the bachelor party on time. That journey across Hell's Own waters was almost as harrowing as the flight that followed, but that's definitely a story for another time. Story 8, The Watchers in the Snow. When I was 15, my father and I made what should have been a routine winter trip to our family cottage near Algonquin Park. I had always been amazed by the beauty of that area, having grown up spending every summer enjoying the pristine lakes and endless forests that made it one of Ontario's most treasured wilderness areas. Our cottage sat on a large lake about 30 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by thousands of similar retreats that transformed the area into a bustling community during the warm months. Summer at the lake was everything you'd expect from cottage country. The population would triple as families escaped city life for long weekends and extended vacations. The lake would be dotted with motorboats and swimmers, while the evenings filled with the sounds of laughter and campfires. Children would run freely between cottages, creating temporary friendships that lasted entire seasons, and adults would relax on docks with cold drinks and endless conversations. But winter was a completely different world. When the warm weather ended, most cottage owners would board up their properties and return to urban life, leaving the area largely deserted until spring. The beautiful pine trees would become heavy with snow, creating a forest so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. Our cottage was located on a dead-end road with about 20 other properties spaced far enough apart that our closest neighbors were invisible through the thick woods. My father needed to complete some painting projects that my mother had been requesting for months, and he'd decided to tackle them during a long February weekend when he could work without interruption. I tagged along to keep him company and to spend some quality time together, away from the distractions of home and school. What should have been a 5-hour drive turned into an 8-hour ordeal due to heavy snow that seemed to worsen with every mile. It was well past midnight when we finally drove through the park itself, surrounded by deadly quiet and pitch-black darkness, except for our headlights cutting through the falling snow. The familiar landmarks looked foreign and ominous under their white blankets, and even the roads seemed different, narrower and more treacherous than I remembered. When we turned onto our familiar cottage road, my father cursed under his breath. The road hadn't been plowed yet, which wasn't entirely surprising given the remote location and late hour. We probably wouldn't see a snowplow until later that day, if we were lucky. As we drove slowly down the snow-covered road, I noticed a fresh set of tire tracks leading in the same direction we were heading. "The Smiths must be up for the weekend," my father commented, referring to one of our few year-round neighbors. It seemed like a reasonable explanation for the tracks, and I didn't think much of it at the time. As we drove around a bend, following the tire tracks through the deepening snow, our headlights suddenly illuminated a white van parked on the side of the road. The vehicle was almost hidden by the vast trees covered with snow, positioned in a way that suggested the occupants wanted to remain unseen. Through our rear window, as we passed, I could clearly see two figures sitting in the front seat, illuminated briefly by our retreating taillights. "What the hell?" my father mumbled as we continued past the mysterious vehicle. I told him what I'd seen, and he shrugged with the kind of casual dismissal that adults use when they don't want to alarm children. "Maybe they're lost," he suggested, but his tone carried a note of uncertainty that I found troubling. I couldn't help wondering why anyone would choose to park in that particular spot if they were simply lost. Our road was clearly marked as a dead end, and there were no services or businesses that would explain their presence. The whole situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. We pulled into our driveway and began unloading our supplies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The van's presence nagged at me, creating an anxiety that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. Why would two people be sitting in a dark vehicle in the middle of the night, especially in such a remote location? The more I thought about it, the more frightened I became. I begged my father to let me sleep upstairs with him instead of in the downstairs room I usually shared with my sister. That room had large windows with no blinds that looked directly into the blackness of the forest, and my 15-year-old imagination was already working overtime. Without my sister there for company and moral support, the thought of sleeping alone in that exposed room was unbearable. My father was understanding and agreed to let me set up a sleeping bag in his room. As he got ready for bed, I sat in the living room trying to read a book by the light of a small lamp next to the couch. The cottage felt different with all the main lights turned off. Smaller and more vulnerable, as if the darkness outside was pressing against the windows and looking for ways to get in. The silence was so complete I could almost hear my ears ringing. But gradually I began to get the distinct feeling that I was being watched. The living room had two large windows that overlooked the lake, and without curtains to block the view, anyone outside could see directly into our brightly lit space. I turned off the lamp and stood up, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow-covered landscape in an almost magical way. It was actually quite beautiful, the kind of winter scene that belonged on Christmas cards or in fairy tales. But then movement caught my eye, and my heart dropped into my stomach. Two figures were standing down by our back porch, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. They were close enough that I could make out their general shapes and postures, close enough that they could probably see me standing at the window. I immediately dropped to the floor and crawled toward my father's bedroom, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't sure if they had spotted me or not, but I knew I needed to wake my father immediately. By the time he got to the window to look for himself, the figures had vanished into the night. However, their footprints remained in the snow, two distinct sets that led from the road behind our cottage, around to the front of the building, and then back up to the road again. The tracks told a clear story of two people who had deliberately approached our cottage under cover of darkness, circled the building as if conducting surveillance, and then retreated to their vehicle. My father wasn't as alarmed as I was, but he took the situation seriously enough to double-check all the locks and turn on the porch lights, hoping to discourage any further nocturnal visits. He also set the cottage's alarm system before returning to bed, though I noticed he seemed more alert and concerned than he'd initially let on. I lay awake all night next to my father, terrified that I would look toward the window and see someone staring back at me. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. The cottage settling, wind in the trees, snow sliding off the roof. My imagination transformed each innocent noise into evidence of intruders preparing to break in. The next morning, my father went outside to examine the evidence more carefully. The footprints were clearly visible in the daylight, confirming everything I'd seen the night before. The tracks showed that two people had approached from the road, conducted what appeared to be a thorough reconnaissance of our cottage, and then returned to their vehicle. Fresh tire marks in the snow indicated that they had turned around and headed back toward the main road. My father theorized that they were probably looking for cottages to break into, planning to steal electronics and other valuables from properties they assumed would be empty during the winter months. It was a logical explanation. Cottage break-ins were common during the off-season, when most properties sat vacant and unprotected for months at a time. But several things about the situation didn't fit that theory. They had clearly seen our tire tracks leading to the cottage, which would have indicated that someone was home. They had also seen my father's car parked in the driveway, and they couldn't have missed the lamp I'd been using to read, or the fact that it had been turned off shortly before they approached the building. After much discussion, my father called the non-emergency police line to report the incident. The officer who took the report confirmed that there had been several break-ins in the area recently, with thieves targeting cottages that were boarded up for the winter. However, he couldn't explain why anyone would be interested in burglarizing a cottage that clearly had people inside. To this day, I still wonder about the true intentions of those two figures in the snow. Were they simply opportunistic thieves who made a mistake? Or was something more sinister planned for that cold February night? The memory of seeing them standing in our yard, close enough to peer into our windows, still sends chills down my spine decades later. Some questions are better left unanswered, buried in the snow where they can't hurt anyone. Story 9. The Blizzard Drive. I was learning to drive during one of the worst winters in recent memory, and my stepfather had decided that the best way to gain experience was through trial by fire. He let me drive to my sister's town to practice winter highway driving, figuring that the return trip would give me confidence behind the wheel during challenging conditions. Looking back, I'm amazed that anyone thought it was a good idea to let a completely inexperienced driver navigate a highway during a pending snowstorm. The storm wasn't supposed to start until later that evening, so we thought we'd be safely home before conditions deteriorated. We joked about how this might be our last trip ever, the kind of dark humor that families use to cope with potentially dangerous situations. Of course, we had no idea how prophetic those jokes would turn out to be. It started snowing just as we left my sister's town, which wasn't immediately concerning since I'd proven capable of driving in light snow, but the weather deteriorated much faster than anyone had predicted. Within 10 minutes of leaving town, we found ourselves in a complete whiteout that transformed the familiar highway into an alien landscape. I was driving in the left lane at 8 o'clock in the evening, which meant we were surrounded by pitch-black darkness broken only by our headlights. Peak winter in our part of Canada meant that the sun disappeared early and completely, leaving travelers dependent on artificial light to navigate roads that could be treacherous even in good weather. The falling snow created a disorienting effect that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't like the science fiction movies where stars streak past a speeding spacecraft. Instead, the countless flakes filled our windshield view completely, and our headlights bounced off them to create a blinding curtain of white. I couldn't see anything beyond the immediate front of our vehicle. Snow was accumulating along the edges of the windshield by the inch, despite the wipers working at full speed. The Canadian highways we were traveling offered no light sources other than our own headlights for long stretches, which meant we were essentially driving blind through a white void with no reference points to guide us. I was doing my absolute best not to panic, though my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. My stepfather was trying to remain calm while providing guidance, looking for safe places to pull over. But the wind was blowing snow everywhere, making it impossible to see the ditches or lane markings that would normally help us navigate. I had two primary concerns that kept cycling through my mind as we crept along at a dangerously reduced speed. First, since I was in the left lane, I had no idea how far I could pull over before throwing us into a ditch that might be completely filled with snow. Second, I couldn't see the lane markings at all, which meant I might drift into oncoming traffic without realizing it until it was too late. The only guidance I had was the rumble strips along the edge of the highway, which my tires could detect even when visibility was zero. I was using these tactile cues as my primary navigation system, doing something like 45 miles per hour in what was normally a 75 mile per hour zone. My stepfather was guiding me toward the road where his parents lived, hoping we could find a better place to stop and wait out the worst of the storm. We passed maybe 8 cars in the ditch between my sister's town and my grandparents' road, each one a sobering reminder of what could happen when winter driving goes wrong. My speed continued to decrease as the storm intensified and the road conditions worsened. The sky seemed to get darker even though that should have been impossible, and as the snow started to freeze along the highway surface, our tires began to lose what little traction they'd maintained. At some point, the road became completely covered with snow and ice, and even the rumble strips weren't detectable anymore. I was navigating purely on instinct, trying to maintain a straight course while hoping that my sense of direction wouldn't fail us. The faster I tried to go, the less control I had over the vehicle, so I was forced to slow down even more. Then it happened. I hit a sheet of ice at an awkward angle and felt the car begin to spin out of control. We went sliding across the highway into the oncoming lane, and I managed to regain just enough control to see faint headlights approaching through the snow. "Yep, we're in the wrong lane," I announced with remarkable calm, considering that we were seconds away from a head-on collision. "Shouldn't be here at all." Thankfully, I was able to safely move us back into the proper lane before the approaching vehicle reached us. My mother, who had been sitting in the back seat throughout this entire ordeal, was absolutely losing her mind. She was screaming and crying, terrified by our brush with death and the realization that her teenage son was making life or death decisions behind the wheel of a vehicle spinning out of control. My stepfather was surprisingly less calm than I was, though he was trying to keep his composure and avoid grabbing the wheel in a panic. It's not like he could have crawled into the driver's seat and taken over somehow, even if he'd wanted to. We were committed to this course of action whether we liked it or not. I could barely see an inch from the front of the car, but somehow we managed to reach his parents' road and pull over safely. When I stepped out of the vehicle to switch places with my stepfather, the snow was up to my shins and still falling heavily. The storm had intensified to the point where even standing outside for a few seconds was dangerous. We ended up staying the night at my grandparents' house because there was absolutely no way we were making it back home alive, even with an experienced driver behind the wheel. We found out about 15 minutes after arriving that the highway department had closed the entire route due to hazardous conditions. We had been among the last vehicles to make it through before the official shutdown. The next morning, we had to dig our way out of the house just to reach our car, which was completely buried under fresh snow. I got to stay home from school that day since we were stranded out of town, while everyone else had to attend classes as usual. It seemed like a small compensation for nearly dying on a highway the night before. That blizzard drive was my first winter with a learner's permit and my first experience with truly dangerous weather conditions. If we had been driving a smaller car, we never would have made it to my grandparents' house to begin with. The weight and stability of our larger vehicle probably saved our lives that night. I was absolutely terrified throughout the entire experience, but I was determined not to let my parents know how scared I was, especially with my mother already panicking in the back seat. Looking back, we never should have attempted that drive. but it ended up teaching me invaluable lessons about handling emergency situations and extreme weather driving that served me well in later years. It was a nightmare trip that I'll never forget, but it also made me a better and more confident driver in the long run. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences become the most valuable lessons, though. I wouldn't recommend that particular teaching method to anyone else. Story 10. The Slide Toward Death. I was driving up to a ski hill after a fresh snowstorm, looking forward to a day on the slopes, despite my less than ideal vehicle preparation. Not having much money at the time, I hadn't invested in proper winter tires, which was a decision I would come to regret in the most dramatic way possible. Anyone who lives in a snowy region understands the critical importance of good winter tires. They're not just a luxury or a minor convenience. They can literally be the difference between arriving safely at your destination and becoming another roadside casualty. Winter tires won't necessarily get you anywhere your regular tires can't go, but they'll keep you out of ditches and guardrails if you're careful and respectful of the conditions. They provide the crucial extra grip and control that can save your life when things go wrong, which they inevitably do during winter driving. The highway was busy that morning, with other winter sports enthusiasts heading to various mountains and ski areas. I found myself in what was probably the worst possible position for a driver with inadequate tires. There was a tractor-trailer directly in front of me, a car to my left, and another vehicle following behind. I was trapped in the center of potential disaster, surrounded by moving vehicles with nowhere to escape if something went wrong. I did my best to stay sharp and focused, keeping a safe following distance and monitoring the vehicles around me for any signs of trouble. For about 20 minutes, nothing chaotic happened, and I began to relax into the familiar rhythm of highway driving. This was a dangerous mistake that I see drivers make constantly. Once conditions seem stable and predictable, we let our guard down and stop making the split-second calculations that keep us alive. Something shifted in my passenger seat, probably just my gym bag settling or sliding slightly. I took my eyes off the road for what couldn't have been more than a split second to glance over and see what had moved. That tiny moment of inattention was all it took for everything to go completely wrong. Snow is absolutely merciless when you don't have proper tires to handle it. Without winter tires, my worn city slickers were essentially useless on anything more challenging than perfectly clear pavement. I had only made it as far as I had because I was carefully following in the tracks created by the tractor-trailer ahead of me, using his path as a guide through the snow and slush. Just the faintest amount of slush sent me sailing out of control instantly. The right wheels crossed over onto the shoulder and immediately lost what little traction they'd been maintaining. The car began drifting to the right, toward the guardrail that separated the highway from a steep embankment. First, I thought this might actually be the best possible outcome. If I was going to crash, hitting the guardrail and sustaining some body damage seemed preferable to spinning out into traffic or sliding into oncoming vehicles. I took my foot off the gas pedal and tried to coast, avoiding the brakes entirely because I knew that applying them would only contribute to the chaos and send us into a collision at a much higher speed. But I didn't hit the guardrail as expected. The snow had piled up against it during previous storms, forming a natural curb that my car bounced off like a pinball hitting a bumper. I stared in pure shock and terror as the visual scene before me started to rotate, indicating that we were now spinning rather than just sliding. I passed back through the tracks I had been following, but I didn't have the reaction time or the traction necessary to pull out of the slide. Between my delayed response and the impact from bouncing off the snowbank, my car was still without proper grip and continued drifting left across the highway. The truck ahead of me began to slow down, but I didn't want to use my brakes for fear of losing what minimal traction I still had. Now I was facing the very real possibility of slamming into the back of his trailer, going through my windshield and possibly being decapitated by the impact. My car made its way sideways across the entire lane, and I prepared for whatever was going to happen, when I sideswiped the vehicle in the left lane. We came within inches of making contact. I could see the startled face of the other driver as he realized what was happening and tried to maneuver away from my out-of-control vehicle. Fortunately, he had a more capable vehicle and better tires than I did, so he was able to steer away from me just enough to avoid a collision. The humiliation of almost killing a stranger, and possibly his family, brought me back into sharp focus just as I reached the center of my original lane. Miraculously, my tires managed to find some grip at that exact moment, and I was able to resume moving straight forward. I tapped my brakes very gently to avoid rear-ending the truck, which was now much closer than I was comfortable with. The car seemed to be under my control again, and even began accelerating normally through the snow. Writing it all out like this makes the incident seem like it lasted forever, but the entire event couldn't have taken more than a few seconds. Car accidents have an uncanny way of stretching time, making every moment feel like an eternity, while you watch events either improve or worsen in rapid succession. There's something about the real-time reaction to life-threatening situations that dilates time and stretches brief moments into the longest possible experiences. In the end, the only contact my car made was with that snowbank, and even that didn't leave any visible damage. I had escaped a potentially catastrophic situation through what could only be described as incredible luck. The accident could have gone so much worse, not just for me, but for all the other drivers who would have been caught up in a multi-vehicle collision. If I had killed someone else in that slide, it would have affected me for the rest of my life. The knowledge that my poor preparation and momentary inattention could have ended someone else's story would have been unbearable. I was grateful beyond words that everyone involved had walked away unharmed. When I finally reached the ski hill and completed my day on the slopes, the first thing I did upon returning home was purchase a proper set of winter tires. I haven't gone without them since that terrifying morning, and I never will again. Some lessons are worth learning the hard way, but only if you survived to apply the knowledge you've gained. The mountains will always be there, but you only get one chance to make it home safely to enjoy the memories. Story 11. The Barn That Disappeared. I didn't normally work on farms, but I spent 2 months helping my grandfather close down his second property before he sold the buildings and most of the land to focus on his larger farm up in Maine. They knew I needed work, and I drove immediately from Baltimore up to them in my unreliable Ford Focus, eager for both the employment and the chance to work with animals again. The work itself was relatively straightforward, but time-consuming. We spent most of our time moving livestock and their supplies, loading trailer after trailer with chickens, pigs, cows, and even a shipment of horses. This was my first job in a while that involved working directly with animals, and I had forgotten how rewarding that kind of work could be. There's something uniquely satisfying about working with livestock. You get to know their individual personalities and quirks, and they can never talk back to you or create interpersonal drama the way human coworkers sometimes do. It's an honest exchange of labor for care, and it's always rewarding to end the day knowing that all the animals are healthy and well tended. About a month into the project, we had successfully moved most of the animals, which turned out to be fortunate timing because a massive blizzard hit the area shortly afterward. But this wasn't just an ordinary snowstorm. My grandfather's property sat at the bottom of a gentle 2-mile slope, and in snow country, this type of terrain feature creates some of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. When heavy snow accumulates on a gradual incline, it doesn't stay put the way it does on flat ground. Instead, it cascades down the hillside in sheets until it reaches an area where there isn't enough slope left to maintain the momentum. The result is massive snow drifts that can tower 20 feet high or more, creating an otherworldly landscape that can bury entire buildings. The drifts around my grandfather's property were easily 20 feet high in some spots, tall enough to dwarf 2 of the outlying barns and far taller than any of the stables or chicken coops we were still using. To keep essential areas clear, we had to maintain a series of burning barrels strategically placed every 8 feet or so between the house and barn. These weren't small decorative fire pits. We were using large steel drums filled with burning wood and tires, creating blazing infernos that reached temperatures of 800 degrees or more. The barrels had to be kept burning continuously because once the snow got in and doused the fire, the entire barrel would freeze solid and become impossible to restart. This meant rolling around 800-degree steel drums whenever we needed to reposition them, which was exactly as dangerous and unpleasant as it sounds. The wind was harder than anyone in the family had seen in at least 50 years. If you tried to go through a door that opened to the outside, it required both arms to push it open against the pressure. You had to protect your eyes and face because the wind was so intense, it could freeze the moisture in your eyes faster than you could blink. This happened to all of us multiple times, and it was one of the most indescribable pains I've ever experienced. My uncle and I were taking turns filling gas cans in the barn to keep the generators running. These generators were literally keeping us alive, while the wood stoves and burning barrels provided additional heat. The electricity was what powered the essential systems that made survival possible. I felt like I was living in a different century, running back and forth through the storm to maintain the various fires and fuel sources that stood between us and freezing to death. Not long into the blizzard, my uncle fell and broke his leg while he was out there alone. I didn't think to check on him when he didn't return with the gas can, assuming he was just taking longer than usual due to the conditions. When I finally bundled up and pushed through the frost and wind to reach the barn, I found him lying there in the mud and ice, unable to move. He told me he had yelled for help for quite a while, but he quickly realized that no one could possibly hear him over the howling wind. So he just waited, lying in the freezing barn, hoping that someone would eventually come looking for him. Fortunately, my aunt was visiting to help with the move, and she happened to be a doctor. She was able to set his leg and get him properly splinted as well as anyone could under the circumstances. This development meant that almost all of the hour-to-hour labor fell on my shoulders. I had to gather wood for all the fires, fill the barrels, stock up the house, and maintain the generators that were keeping us all alive. I made trip after trip through the storm, carrying armload after armload of supplies until I couldn't go anymore. The ice was starting to form over my eyes and mouth despite all my protective gear. I would thaw out by the fire for 5 minutes and then head back into the storm. We needed more than just wood. We desperately needed gasoline to keep the generators running. I made 6 more trips to collect fuel before I finally gave up, knowing that my fingers and toes were threatening to develop serious frostbite. I wasn't willing to lose any part of my body for the hourly wage they were paying me, regardless of how much the family needed help. Then my grandfather came over to ask me for one more favor. A final trip to the barn to make sure everything was sealed properly before the storm got even worse. I was still dressed in my winter gear and defrosting by the fire, so I agreed to make one more journey into the blizzard. The snow was falling again, piling up on those 20-foot drifts that towered around the property like great white ogres surveying their frozen domain. When I reached the barn, everything appeared to be in order. The fuel line was closed, the lights were off, and nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed something strange. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. For a day and a half, the wind had been howling constantly against the roof and walls, but suddenly there was complete silence. I could still see through the windows that the wind was blowing just as hard as before, but I couldn't hear it at all. I thought something was wrong with me, maybe some weird symptom of hypothermia or something even worse. Perhaps my nervous system was shutting down one sense at a time. Then I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, and I started to feel dizzy and disoriented. The support beams and joints of the barn appeared to be twisting in place, starting to lean at impossible angles. I looked at them in amazement, wondering if I was having some kind of cold-induced hallucination. That's when I heard a sound that broke through the unnatural silence. A sharp pop or snap, something quick and loud, that didn't belong to the normal sounds of a building settling. I looked back up at the walls and realized that while the joints had stopped moving, the wall boards were actually rippling like water. A window exploded above me, and suddenly I understood what was happening. I couldn't hear the wind because the snow had completely covered the barn. Those massive drifts had piled up so high and so thick that they blocked any light wind from touching the building. Now all that accumulated weight was starting to move, and the barn was going to move with it. The structure was seconds away from complete collapse. I abandoned everything and sprinted for the exit, diving through the doorway and landing hard on the ice outside. I skated on my chest over to one of the burning barrels and turned around just in time to watch a 40-foot snowdrift erase the barn from existence. I had expected an explosive sound, like you might hear when a building collapses in a movie, but the insulation provided by all that snow kept the destruction relatively quiet. The barn simply disappeared beneath an avalanche of white, as if it had never existed at all. My grandfather couldn't believe it when I went inside and told him what had happened. We were all in complete disbelief until the sun came out about 30 minutes later and began to burn off the storm clouds. That was the last winter job I ever accepted and the last time I underestimated the power of accumulated snow. Some forces of nature are simply too powerful for human structures to withstand, no matter how well built they might be. Story 12, the lake that almost kept me. I was pretty new at driving when I decided to attempt my first drive across a frozen lake, which is a huge rite of passage for young people in Minnesota. It sounds exactly like what it is, kids taking their cars across the frozen surface of really large lakes during the winter months. It's actually much less risky than it might sound to someone from a warmer climate, since the surface ice can be 4 or 5 feet thick, creating a solid sheet that's almost indestructible. Sometimes you'll see a dozen trucks parked in the same vicinity on the ice, representing tens of thousands of pounds, sitting directly on top of what's essentially a massive frozen platform. Between these vehicles, ice fishermen drill holes through the surface to reach the water below, and even with this additional weight and the compromised integrity from the holes, the ice holds strong without any problems. I kept all of this reassuring information in mind as I left solid ground and rolled out onto the frozen water for the first time. It's an unsettling, almost sickening feeling during your initial experiences. The driving itself feels no different from being on land when you're behind the wheel, but mentally, you're aware that there are hundreds of feet of frigid water ready to crush you into nothing just a few feet below your vehicle's engine. Things seemed fine for the first few minutes of my adventure. I was following a well-traveled path that had been plowed and marked by previous vehicles, which gave me confidence that I was taking a safe and established route. But as I approached the center of the lake, I started getting nervous about my navigation. It was extremely difficult to see anything except the plowed path directly in front of me, and I suddenly realized that I had no idea where this route would lead me, or even if it actually crossed to the other side of the lake. The path might simply end in the middle of nowhere, leaving me stranded far from shore with no way to turn around. This was when you typically heard about lake crossings going badly wrong. People would get confused about directions and drive confidently across the lake, only to discover that they had proceeded directly into wilderness areas with no roads or services. Since these remote areas aren't plowed or regularly traveled, some drivers would get completely lost and eventually stuck in deep snow, with no way to call for help. The other common scenario was following tire tracks that simply stopped abruptly, leaving you facing an 8-foot snow wall with no space to turn around. In that situation, your only option would be to back up the entire distance you had traveled until you reached shore again, which could be several miles of extremely dangerous reverse driving. Considering these possibilities, I decided that the smartest course of action would be to turn around and head back to shore while I still knew where I was. I came upon a small area that looked like it might serve as a turning space. It wasn't much of a clearing, but the snow didn't appear to be piled up as high, which suggested that it might be passable. I came to a complete stop, which actually made me more nervous than moving had. It felt like the stationary weight might be somehow heavier or more dangerous to the ice, though logically I knew that the ice either would or wouldn't support a vehicle regardless of whether it was moving or stationary. As soon as I backed off the plowed area to attempt my turn, I became hopelessly stuck in over a foot of unpacked snow. I tried every trick I could think of, including putting my floor mats under the tires for traction, but they just went flying 20 feet behind the car without providing any help whatsoever. I tried digging out around the tires with my snow scraper, but all I succeeded in doing was breaking off a fingernail and causing my finger to start bleeding from the cold and the sharp ice. This was long before cell phones were common, so I couldn't call for assistance or let anyone know where I was. Finally, I realized that I was going to have to abandon the car and walk back to shore to get help. This was a sobering realization because I was probably at least 3 miles from the nearest road, and it was at least a mile just to reach the shoreline. I had never fully appreciated just how far out you could be when driving across a large lake. I gathered all the warm clothing and supplies I could carry, including several jackets and a cheap red flashlight that would have to serve as my only source of light once darkness fell. Unfortunately for me, the temperature was about 20 degrees below zero, and I quickly discovered that walking across an open lake on a windy night was far more challenging than I had anticipated. A frozen lake is essentially a flat, open plain with absolutely nothing to shield you from the wind. By the time I finally reached an area with houses, I was seriously concerned that I might die of hypothermia before finding help. My extremely introverted and socially awkward teenage self had to overcome significant anxiety to knock on a stranger's door and ask for assistance. Someone finally answered, and I explained my predicament as clearly as I could while trying not to collapse from exhaustion and cold. They kindly allowed me to use their phone, and I called home feeling relieved that help was finally within reach. I was also grateful for the warmth of their house, which felt like paradise after my trek across the frozen wasteland. My younger brother answered the phone, and I told him to get our father immediately. Instead, he said nope and hung up on me. I called back thinking this was just typical sibling teasing, but he must have left the phone off the hook because I could only get a busy signal. After trying several more times and feeling increasingly awkward about imposing on these generous strangers, I decided that my only option was to walk the rest of the way home. My burning hatred of my brother and detailed plans for revenge actually helped keep me warm during the remainder of my journey. I made it home with only one small spot of frostbite on my finger, caused by a hole in my glove that I hadn't noticed until it was too late. My brother received a thorough lecture from our father, just as I did for attempting to drive on the lake in the first place. The next day, Dad drove me back to retrieve my car, which thankfully hadn't been towed or vandalized during its overnight stay on the ice. I haven't had any interest in driving on frozen lakes since that experience. Some rites of passage are better left unattempted, especially when the consequences of failure involve freezing to death in the middle of nowhere. Story 13, the dumpster that saved my life. A few years ago, around Thanksgiving, it snowed a foot overnight in what became one of the most dangerous and humbling experiences of my life. I was homeless at the time, riding my bike and trailing a heavy bike cart that had developed a flat tire. The sun was going down, and snow was starting to fall again, making travel increasingly difficult and dangerous. I was sweating and exhausted from trying to pull the cart through the snow and slush, with that flat tire dragging behind me. The additional weight and resistance made every pedal stroke a struggle, and I knew I needed to stop and assess the damage before I could continue. I pulled into an empty parking lot and found a small overhang where I could work on the tire with some protection from the elements. The overhang was tiny, barely extending a foot out from the building's wall, so it only provided cover for my body while I worked. The bike and cart remained fully exposed to the falling snow and wind. I examined the tire carefully, looking at the rip in the rubber and trying to determine if there was anything I could do to repair it with the limited materials I had available. After studying the damage, I realized that there was no way to fix the tire without proper tools and supplies that I simply didn't have access to. There was a brief break in the storm when the wind calmed down, and I decided to rest for just a few minutes before starting the difficult journey back to the place where I stayed each night. What I intended to be a brief rest turned into 4 hours of unconsciousness. I had fallen into such a deep sleep that I was completely unaware of my surroundings or the continuing snowfall. The problem was that it had started snowing heavily again not long after I fell asleep, and when I finally woke up, I was buried under another 6 inches of fresh snow. The sweat on my skin and coat liner had turned to frost while I slept, and I was certain that I was either hypothermic or very close to it. My body temperature had dropped dangerously low, and my muscles were barely responding to my attempts to move. It took me 30 minutes of struggling to fight my way out of the snow that had accumulated over me. The snow was heavy, wet, and dense, making it extremely difficult to push aside even when I was fully conscious and alert. My muscles were operating at the point of failure, and even after I managed to uncover myself, I could barely stand upright. I used my bike's handlebars to pull myself up to my feet, swaying unsteadily as I tried to assess my situation. The parking lot was completely barren, offering no obvious options for shelter or warmth. There was an office entrance to the building, but even that was blown in with snow and clearly accessible. I was scanning the area desperately for any possible refuge when I spotted it, a large green dumpster sitting against the far wall of the building. It certainly wasn't one of my proudest moments, but I was facing a life-or-death situation with limited options. I shambled back to my bike cart, pulled my blanket roll from the interior storage, and made my way over to the big green container. It was one of those commercial dumpsters with a double flip lid top that opened from both sides. I threw my blankets inside and dove in after them, grateful to discover that the dumpster contained just a few bags of garbage and loose cardboard rather than anything truly disgusting. Even if it had been filled with the most revolting waste imaginable, I wouldn't have cared at that point. Survival was the only thing that mattered. I spent the entire night in that dumpster, surrounded by putrid smells and rubbing all the parts of my body that kept falling asleep from the cold. The cardboard actually came in handy for additional insulation, and I used it to fill gaps around the lid that were letting wind and snow into my makeshift shelter. I had resigned myself to losing my bike and belongings, assuming that someone would spot them during the night and simply roll them away without bothering to look for an owner. Even in a storm, there were always opportunistic people cruising around looking for easy targets and unattended property to steal. But when I cracked open my fortress the next morning, I discovered that I had been wrong about that assumption. The sun was shining brightly, my body had recovered from the dangerous hypothermia, and my bike was still exactly where I had left it the night before. No one had disturbed my belongings or taken advantage of my vulnerable situation. That narrow escape from death was one of several events that ultimately helped me turn my life around and escape homelessness permanently. Sometimes what feels like rock bottom is actually a catapult that launches you toward better circumstances and a renewed appreciation for life's basic necessities. The experience taught me never to underestimate the dangers of winter weather and the importance of having backup plans when you're living without traditional shelter. It also showed me that survival sometimes requires swallowing your pride and accepting help from unexpected sources, even if that source happens to be a garbage dumpster behind an office building. Story 14, the walk that nearly killed me. When I was in college, I lost the key to my car and didn't have a spare, which created a problem that seemed to have only one solution. It was the middle of winter, and I didn't feel like I could ask anyone for a ride to the car dealership, so I decided to walk the 6 or 7 miles from my apartment to get a replacement key. In hindsight, this seems like an incredibly desperate and poorly thought out decision, but at the time it felt like the most straightforward approach to solving my problem. I think I was using the winter weather as an excuse not to impose on friends or admit that I needed help, though the harsh conditions were actually the best possible reason to ask for assistance. Walking in snow is exhausting under the best of circumstances. But I was young and 7 miles didn't sound impossibly far. I was completely wrong about that assessment. The journey to the dealership turned out to be the most physically demanding thing I had ever attempted. The first mile took my breath away and left me questioning my decision. But after that, each step required noticeably more effort than the last. My energy levels weren't great to begin with, since the stress of being without transportation had already depleted my physical and emotional reserves. The other major mistake I made was not realizing that there would be another 7 miles waiting for me on the return trip. This really was a desperate plan rather than a carefully considered strategy. I hadn't thought through any aspect of the journey or prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. I arrived at the dealership in the early afternoon, but the process took much longer than I had expected. The quote they had given me over the phone turned out to be significantly shorter than the actual time required. 1 hour turned into 2, and then I didn't hear back from anyone for what felt like an eternity. The sun was setting and snow was starting to fall again by the time someone finally emerged with an envelope containing my replacement keys. Now I faced the prospect of navigating the snowy roadways in complete darkness for the return journey. I pulled my flimsy hood up against the wind and snow, but it was completely useless against the elements. The gusts cut right through the thin fabric, and my entire face was frozen numb within the first 10 minutes of walking. My phone showed that the temperature had dropped from 19 degrees to 25 below zero, which accounted for the wind chill that made every exposed inch of skin feel like it was being attacked with needles. I had frozen my scarf so stiff that I had to pull it inside my jacket to warm it up before I could wrap it around my face, though even that provided minimal protection. I could feel my lips blistering from the extreme temperatures, and another factor presented itself that I hadn't anticipated. I had forgotten my inhaler. It was sitting in my school bag back at the apartment, which meant I had to be extremely careful not to breathe too deeply or trigger an asthma attack during the most physically demanding situation of my life. My breathing was just about the only thing I had any control over, so I was forced to slow down my pace even more to accommodate my compromised respiratory system. It felt like a death trap for someone with my medical condition, requiring me to move slower and slower while the temperatures continued to plummet around me. I started hearing a strange, tiny clicking noise, and realized that the condensation from my breath had settled on my eyelashes and frozen solid, making them clink together every time I blinked. I laughed at first, finding the absurdity of the situation amusing despite my circumstances, but after hearing the sound for several minutes, I started to panic about whether my eyelashes might break off entirely, or worse, whether the frost might extend to the liquid in my eyeballs and begin to freeze them as well. I was getting colder and more exhausted with each step, and the simple act of moving forward required increasingly heroic effort just to maintain my forward progress. About 3 blocks from my apartment, the inevitable happened. The asthma attack I had been dreading finally began. It started as a biting fire in my chest and quickly progressed to the point where my lungs felt empty and shriveled. It was like someone had hit me in the back with a sledgehammer and knocked every bit of air out of my body. Now I was trying to breathe through what felt like a straw, while maintaining enough forward momentum to reach safety. It's a terrifying, panic-inducing feeling that I couldn't afford to give in to. I had to reach my inhaler, which I knew was waiting for me in my school bag. I could picture exactly where it was sitting, just a few blocks away, but those final 3 blocks felt like 3 miles given my deteriorating condition. Somehow I managed to stagger the rest of the way home, though I kept losing track of whether my feet were actually moving or not. Sometimes I thought I was standing completely still, but when I looked down, I would realize I was somehow still in motion. It was a very strange hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. When I finally made it inside, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, opened the door, and collapsed on the couch where I had left my bag. My numb fingers fumbled for the inhaler, but I only managed to take one of the required 2 puffs before the oxygen deprivation rendered me unconscious. I had never passed out before, and the involuntary nature of losing consciousness was absolutely terrifying. My roommates discovered me later and assumed I was just taking a nap, so they covered me with a blanket without realizing the severity of what had happened. I was still wearing my boots and all my winter gear when they found me. I regained consciousness several hours later, feeling weak and wheezing as my awareness slowly returned. As the events of the day came back to me, I broke down and sobbed as quietly as I could, overwhelmed by how close I had come to dying from my own stubborn pride and poor planning. I could feel a deep chill in the space between my organs that seemed to go beyond normal cold. It was as if the winter had settled into my very core. I was frightened to remove my boots and examine my feet, worried about what I might find after hours of walking through sub-zero temperatures. The 1 puff from my inhaler had been enough to open my airway sufficiently to keep me alive, and I used it again to further improve my breathing. Though I probably should have gone to the hospital for evaluation, I decided to treat myself at home with layers of warm clothing and hot mint tea before going to bed. Aside from the absolutely destroyed muscles in my legs and chest, my body seemed to have survived the ordeal without permanent damage. There was a persistent throbbing in my head, but not severe enough to force me back out into the dangerous cold for medical attention. Then, in a moment of panic, I remembered the entire purpose of my near-fatal journey, the replacement keys that I had risked my life to obtain. I frantically searched through my coat pockets until I found the envelope from the dealership. There they were, safe and sound. 2 shiny new keys that represented both my transportation solution and my brush with death. All was right in my winter wonderland, though it had nearly cost me everything. My roommates were absolutely flabbergasted when I told them the full story the next day. They had genuinely believed I was just taking a particularly deep nap, having no idea that I had been unconscious from oxygen deprivation and hypothermia. I was incredibly lucky to have survived the experience without serious injury or death. Obviously, the next time I found myself in a similar situation, I swallowed my pride and asked friends for help rather than attempting another potentially fatal solo expedition. Some lessons are only learned through near-death experiences, but the smart approach is to learn from other people's mistakes rather than making your own. The keys worked perfectly and my car started without any problems. Sometimes the simplest solutions require the most dangerous journeys, but that doesn't mean they're worth the risk. Story 15. The Reckless Driver and the Bridge. I was driving to work during the tail end of a massive snowstorm, providing what was considered essential food service for a college campus. Many of the students living in dormitories didn't have kitchens or personal vehicles, which meant they wouldn't be able to eat if we didn't maintain our services during severe weather conditions. Even restaurants near the campus had closed during the Level 3 snow emergency that had been declared within the city limits. The informal policy at work for these dangerous situations was simply to make an honest effort if possible, but never to risk your life for the job. I was one of the few employees who owned a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and I had the largest truck available, a crew cab that could transport multiple workers safely through the storm. My plan was to drive down to campus and pick up co-workers who lived nearby and wanted to come in despite the conditions. I was rolling down the highway at a decent pace in the only lane that had been partially plowed, staying in the far left and keeping my truck in 4-wheel drive mode. There weren't many other vehicles on the road, which was understandable given the continuing snowfall and hazardous driving conditions. Things seemed to be going relatively smoothly, and I was feeling confident about my ability to navigate the storm safely. But overconfidence is always dangerous during winter driving. When you start feeling relaxed and comfortable, that's precisely when you stop making the split-second defensive decisions that keep you alive. You begin reacting to situations instead of anticipating them, and that's when you forfeit the control that's essential for safe travel in dangerous conditions. I was maintaining about 40 miles per hour when I noticed a pair of headlights approaching from behind me much faster than was safe or reasonable for the conditions. I assumed it had to be an emergency vehicle, police, ambulance, or fire department responding to a crisis somewhere ahead. I couldn't imagine any other reason for someone to be driving so aggressively during a blizzard. When the vehicle got close enough for me to identify it, however, I could see that it was actually a large lifted SUV rather than any kind of emergency responder. My farm truck was pretty substantial, but I had no interest in tangling with something that massive during a snowstorm, especially when the other driver was clearly demonstrating poor judgment and reckless behavior. I signaled to move over to the middle lane and began easing toward the far right, assuming the SUV had four-wheel drive capability, but questioning the driver's intelligence and experience. There was absolutely no reason to be driving at that speed on ice and snow, regardless of what kind of vehicle you were operating or how confident you felt behind the wheel. I let off the accelerator and started inching toward the right lane just as the SUV was preparing to overtake me. We were approaching a bridge at that moment, which made the situation even more dangerous since bridges typically freeze before regular roadway surfaces and provide even less traction for vehicles. Just as we were heading onto the bridge structure, something went catastrophically wrong for the aggressive driver. The ice finally got the better of him, and his SUV began fishtailing wildly as he lost complete control of the vehicle. I immediately began applying my brakes as gently as possible, trying to slow down without risking the same fate for myself. I knew without any doubt that this driver was in serious trouble, possibly facing injury or death depending on how the situation developed. I was desperately trying to create as much distance as possible between our vehicles, knowing that crashes in these conditions often pull multiple cars into the chaos through sliding, collisions with embankments, or other unpredictable factors. The SUV completely lost traction and went spinning across my lane, missing my truck by what couldn't have been more than a few inches. For a split second, we were windshield to windshield, close enough that I could make direct eye contact with the terrified driver. I could see the absolute terror in his eyes as he realized he was no longer in control of his vehicle and had no idea what was about to happen. Then he spun away from me into the darkness, sliding off the highway right where the guardrail ended and sailing directly into a cluster of trees. I saw the branches shake violently and snow fall in a great whoosh, followed by the faint glow of his taillights somewhere deep in the woods. After that, there was nothing but darkness and the continued howling of the wind. I immediately knew I had to report this accident, knowing how common it was for drivers to send their vehicles off roadways during winter storms, only to never be found until spring thaw revealed their locations. The person who had just crashed might be unconscious with no memory of where they were, and even if they remained conscious, the impact could have scattered the contents of their vehicle to the point where they couldn't locate essential items like their cell phone. I saw a couple of other vehicles behind me slowing down and pulling off to help, so I called 911 to report the accident, and then continued on to work. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that I thought I might need assistance prying them off when I arrived at my destination. It's not always the ice and snow that create the most dangerous situations during winter driving. Often, it's the reckless idiots you share the roads with, who don't understand how to drive safely in challenging conditions. This particular driver had not only wrecked through his own poor judgment, but had nearly taken me along with him in the process. The experience served as a reminder that defensive driving becomes even more critical during severe weather, not just because of the conditions themselves, but because of the increased likelihood that you'll encounter other drivers who are operating well beyond their abilities or comfort zones. I made it to work safely and picked up the coworkers who needed transportation, grateful that we were all able to provide essential services to students who depended on us during the emergency. Sometimes doing the right thing requires taking calculated risks, but there's a significant difference between reasonable caution and reckless endangerment. The memory of that terrified face and the spinning SUV stayed with me for a long time afterward, serving as a sobering reminder of how quickly winter driving situations can deteriorate and how little control any of us really have when the elements decide to assert their dominance over human transportation plans. Story 16. The Desert Messenger. When I was younger, I spent my summers driving big rigs across the country to earn extra money while pursuing my education. My wife often joined me on these journeys, and she had even obtained her commercial driver's license so she could take over if needed. Those summer road trips became some of our most treasured memories together, waking up each day to the unpredictable beauty of life on the open road. The route that would change everything for us began in Idaho, where we had successfully delivered our load. We were now headed back with a different trailer in tow, making excellent time despite a minor delay that kept us in Tucson longer than we had planned. As darkness settled over the Arizona desert, we found ourselves only an hour outside the city, both feeling the weight of the long day pressing down on our shoulders. We spotted a truck stop ahead, hoping to rest for the night, but when we pulled into the lot, we discovered it was completely packed. Every single parking stall was occupied by semis and smaller trucks, and even the lane spaces were crowded with vehicles parked illegally. The scene reminded us of travelers seeking shelter from an approaching storm. After making a careful U-turn through the chaotic lot, we decided to continue down the highway, hoping to find a suitable place to park for the night. Fortune smiled upon us when we discovered a large, dusty area just off the highway. A wide dirt road led us about 100 feet from the main route before opening into what appeared to be a recreational field. My wife speculated that once the sun rose, we would probably see dirt bike jumps and riding trails scattered throughout the area, possibly even a small racing circuit carved into the desert floor. The only landmark visible in the darkness was a cluster of trees standing sentinel in the distance. We assumed they marked a wash or creek bed that provided enough water to sustain the desert vegetation. After completing our usual routine of checking the load, securing everything properly, and placing safety cones behind the trailer, I inspected the tires while my wife handled the mileage logs and other paperwork that came with our profession. With our duties completed, we settled into our evening routine. We shared a light dinner, played a few hands of cards, and then prepared for sleep in the comfortable darkness of our cab. The night was perfectly still and peaceful, with only the gentle sounds of the desert settling around us. I remember thinking how serene everything felt as we drifted off to sleep, because when we awakened hours later, the atmosphere had transformed into something entirely different. My wife's urgent shaking jolted me from deep sleep, her voice filled with concern as she insisted that something was wrong. As I sat up and looked around our sleeping area, I couldn't immediately see anything amiss. We used a divider to separate the cab from our sleeping quarters, but even through that barrier, I could now hear and feel what had alarmed her. Something was causing our massive truck to rock gently back and forth. Now, anyone familiar with commercial vehicles knows that trucks and their trailers weigh many tons, making them incredibly stable and difficult to move. However, it's not impossible for external forces to create movement. Strong winds can push the cab around and make the trailer sway like a giant metal pendulum. Road conditions, potholes, or even someone climbing on the vehicle can create subtle vibrations that are felt inside the cab. What we were experiencing felt different from any of these familiar sensations. The movement seemed to come from ground level, as if we were surrounded by a herd of large animals gently bumping against the truck. In our drowsy state, this explanation actually made sense to us. We were, after all, in cattle country, and Arizona ranchers often moved their herds across vast stretches of land, especially during the monsoon season when water sources shifted. We lay there for a while, trying to convince ourselves to return to sleep, and I actually managed to doze off briefly. However, my wife woke me again, and this time I could tell that her concern had deepened into genuine fear. The rocking motion had intensified significantly, and now we could hear a strange whooshing sound from outside, like wind, but with an odd metallic echo that defied easy description. I climbed out of our bunk and retrieved my flashlight, deciding it was time to investigate. Rather than removing the light blockers from our rear windows, I pushed aside the divider and peered through the windshield. The view that greeted me was both fascinating and unsettling. I couldn't see any animals or moving vegetation, but I could observe different shades of darkness twisting and swirling together, creating patterns that looked almost like special effects from a movie. When I turned on my flashlight and pressed it against the window to see past the reflection, I found nothing but the expected desert landscape: dirt, sparse weeds, occasional cacti, and scattered rocks. There was no sign of the animals I had expected to find, nor any evidence of the swirling darkness I had witnessed moments before. When my wife asked what I could see out there, I told her honestly that there was nothing visible, not even the cloud of dust that a herd of animals would certainly have kicked up. The moment I clicked off my flashlight, our entire truck and trailer swayed so violently that I was thrown against the wall of the cab and nearly fell to the floor. My wife's scream pierced the night as the sensation reminded us of being tossed about on rough seas or struck by a speeding train. I struggled back to my feet, grabbing the passenger seat for support while trying to maintain a position where I could observe the area outside without being easily seen. The truck remained still after that dramatic movement, but we could now hear a new sound, a rhythmic tapping or clicking that resembled stone striking metal. My wife made a comparison that sent chills down my spine, saying it sounded exactly like our small dog's claws skittering across the tile floor of our kitchen back home. For reasons I couldn't quite explain, this observation unsettled me more than anything else we had experienced that night. As we sat in tense silence, I noticed movement near the distant tree line we had spotted earlier. Ducking down and squinting through the passenger window, I watched as a figure moved between the trees. At first, I assumed it must be an animal, hoping it might be something large enough to explain the force that had rocked our truck. However, when the figure stepped away from the tree line and into the open desert, I realized I was looking at a person walking carefully among the rocks and sand. The figure appeared to be a man, and he was looking away from our truck toward the trees. I whispered this observation to my wife, who immediately became agitated and insisted that I start the engine so we could leave immediately. Something in me, perhaps curiosity or a need for logical explanation, compelled me to ask her to remain calm and wait just a bit longer. We were relatively safe inside our locked cab, and I felt that understanding what was happening was important. Reluctantly, my wife agreed to wait and joined me at the passenger window. We watched as the mysterious figure moved away from the trees, stopped, and began making strange dance-like motions that lasted only a few seconds. Then he pointed toward a collection of stones, appearing to look back and forth between the rocks and our truck. In the next instant, he simply vanished, not as if he had walked away or hidden, but as though he had never been there at all. What had appeared to be his distinct silhouette dissolved into a shapeless shadow beneath the desert moon. We spent considerable time discussing what we had witnessed, questioning whether it had been real or some sort of shared hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. After several years of summer trucking, nothing like this had ever happened to us before. With the truck now completely still and the mysterious stranger gone, fatigue began to overwhelm us. We needed rest to maintain our driving schedule, so we decided to catch a few hours of sleep and depart before dawn. The remainder of that night proved to be one of the most peaceful I had ever experienced. I slept deeply and soundly without tossing, turning, or waking until my natural alarm clock roused me. There were no sounds, no disturbances, and no commotion. I felt remarkably centered and refreshed. My wife reported the same experience, and we attributed this unexpected tranquility to an adrenaline crash following the night's unusual event. After our morning routine of brushing teeth and preparing for the day, I stepped outside to relieve myself while the engine warmed up. I performed a quick pre-trip inspection and surveyed the terrain for any obstacles that might pose problems when we departed. As I wandered off to find a suitable place for my morning business, I had nearly forgotten the previous night's strangeness until I saw the distant tree line and decided to investigate. The area around the trees contained nothing particularly noteworthy: dead grass, thorny bushes, and tall mesquite trees. The only evidence of human presence was typical roadside litter, discarded cups and snack wrappers. I followed the path where the mysterious figure had walked until I reached the rocks he had been pointing toward. After taking care of my immediate needs behind a convenient tree, I found myself drawn to examine those stones more closely. Initially, the rock formation appeared unremarkable, just scattered stones and dirt. I kicked around between some of the larger rocks and climbed onto the highest outcrop for a better view of the surrounding area. That's when I noticed what appeared to be the brim of a hat at my feet, followed by the unmistakable outline of a human skull and other bones, ribs, fingers, and toes. Everything was clearly human remains, partially buried in the sand and dirt. We immediately contacted local law enforcement via our radio, and Sheriff's Department officers along with state police arrived at the scene quickly. They confirmed that this was a known location where missing persons occasionally turned up, both alive and deceased. The desert trail system in the surrounding hills was notorious for claiming victims. Vagrants and people in crisis would sometimes wander off without realizing how far they were from civilization, eventually succumbing to the harsh elements and dehydration. The officers didn't immediately suspect foul play, but they treated the scene as a potential crime until they could establish the identity of the deceased. We provided our account of the previous night's events, and I led them to where the bones were located. They immediately began securing the area with crime scene tape and informed us that the remains had been there for quite some time, weathered and partially buried by natural processes. After several hours of questioning and documentation, we were cleared to continue our journey. The police explained that this particular area was occasionally known for such discoveries, as the combination of harsh desert conditions and isolation made it a dangerous place for unprepared individuals. When we called for a follow-up at the end of the summer, the remains still hadn't been identified, remaining classified as a John Doe case. My wife prefers to believe that we encountered the spirit of the deceased person that night, a lost soul trying to guide us to his final resting place so he could find peace in the afterlife. I remain more skeptical, attributing our experiences to natural phenomena like wind patterns and shadows playing tricks in the moonlight. However, I cannot deny that these unexplained events led directly to our discovery of the remains the following morning. Nothing similar has ever happened to us before or since. We don't live in a haunted house, we've never claimed to have psychic abilities, and supernatural occurrences are not part of our normal experience. I'm still not entirely convinced that anything supernatural occurred that night. The investigating officers suggested that the remains probably hadn't been discovered earlier because of their location. The trees and rocks were positioned in a way that made them obstacles rather than destinations for recreational vehicle users, who typically unloaded their equipment and headed directly into the hills. Regardless of the true explanation for our experience, it remains one of the most memorable and unsettling nights of our trucking career. Whether we witnessed something supernatural or simply experienced a series of coincidental natural phenomena, I'm grateful that the encounter was a one-time occurrence. Most importantly, I hope that whoever we found out there didn't suffer during their final moments in that remote desert location. Story 17, The Midnight Visitor. I spent most of my working life in manual labor, but in the early 2000s I accepted a trucking position that offered an irresistible package, full-time pay for part-time hours, provided I could meet the scheduled delivery times. The job came with complete benefits, insurance coverage, and everything a working person could hope for. After obtaining my commercial driver's license and several additional certifications, I found myself on the road within just a month. Throughout my trucking career, I encountered numerous situations that ranged from merely strange to completely bizarre. But one particular evening stands out as the most unsettling experience of my entire time behind the wheel. I prefer straightforward storytelling without unnecessary embellishment, so I'll recount the events exactly as they occurred. I was making a return trip from Oregon to Minnesota, having already completed one delivery and picked up a second load that would take me home. This particular night found me at roughly the halfway point of my journey, traveling through some of the most beautiful yet isolated territory in the American West. The weather was perfect, my spirits were high, and I was feeling motivated by the fact that my schedule was running well ahead of the projected timeline. Early in my trucking career, I had learned the importance of not pushing myself too hard or burning out from excessive caffeine and stimulant use. Nothing was more defeating than arriving home from a long haul too exhausted to enjoy my time off. I had developed a philosophy of taking things steady and maintaining a level pace throughout each journey. Additionally, I have a heart condition that makes heavy caffeine intake inadvisable, so I relied on natural methods to maintain my energy levels. My approach centered on maintaining a good diet, regular exercise, and most importantly, a consistent sleep schedule. This meant stopping at approximately the same time each night and ensuring I got adequate rest before continuing. Many of my assigned trips were calculated down to the very last minute, but I had developed a system that allowed me to always arrive on schedule while maintaining my health and sanity. After crossing the Idaho border, I found myself driving through the vast expanse of Montana, a region known for its breathtaking beauty but sparse population. My route took me through Missoula and several other established townships, but between these communities, travelers could consider themselves fortunate to find even a basic service station. These rural stretches always kept me alert, as I had heard countless horror stories about drivers running out of fuel, experiencing tire blowouts, or encountering engine trouble with no assistance available for 75 miles in any direction. The isolation was particularly pronounced during early morning hours, when I might drive for an entire hour without seeing another vehicle on the road. My destination for the night was a truck stop located in the middle of nowhere between Bozeman and Livingston. My plan was to roll through Bozeman around dinner time, grab a quick meal, and then continue toward the truck stop. After about an hour of driving to let my food digest properly, I would reach my target location, pull over, and be completely ready for a good night's sleep. I valued routine, structure, and having a clear plan for each day. That night, everything was supposed to proceed smoothly, and initially my expectations were met perfectly. My plan unfolded exactly as anticipated. I obtained dinner, filled up with fuel, encountered minimal traffic, and was back on the road in record time. Soon I could feel the familiar drowsiness that comes from digestion combined with a long day of concentrated driving. But there ahead of me were the welcoming lights of my intended rest stop. Anyone who has spent time on America's interstate highway system knows exactly what I'm describing. Those large concrete pull-out areas positioned alongside major highways every 100 miles or so. These facilities typically include restroom facilities, vending machines, trash receptacles, and everything that people living on the road might need for basic comfort and maintenance. When I pulled into this particular rest area, I discovered something that pleased me greatly: the complete absence of any other vehicles. No one else was using this facility, and I found a certain sense of security in having the place entirely to myself. I followed my usual routine of allowing the truck to cool down, securing everything properly, and then making my way to the living space in the back of the cab. My sleeping area was spartanly furnished but comfortable, containing a bed, a small table attached to the wall, and an overhead shelf for storing my personal belongings. I also maintained a small portable power source that I used to charge a flip-style DVD player, one of those technological marvels of the early 2000s that featured both a player and a screen in a single compact unit. I settled in with my blankets and pillows and selected one of my favorite films to watch, either Resident Evil or Reign of Fire, both action thrillers that I had watched dozens of times. Despite the loud gunfire and explosions emanating from the speakers, I found myself drifting off to sleep within about 30 minutes. I closed the DVD player, surrendered to the comfortable darkness of my cab, and prepared for what I expected to be a peaceful night's rest. I must have been asleep for only a couple of hours when something jolted me awake. I couldn't immediately identify what had disturbed my sleep, but I knew with certainty that something had interrupted my rest. I have a tendency to snore occasionally, and sometimes these louder episodes wake me up, so I initially assumed that might have been the cause. I snuggled deeper into my blankets, planning to capture a few more hours of sleep before hitting the road again, before sunrise, to gain extra miles before the rest of the world awakened. Just as I was closing my eyes again, I heard the sound that had actually awakened me. It wasn't a snore as I had assumed, but rather the sharp sound of someone coughing. The cough seemed to originate from somewhere outside my cab, out in the parking area. The sound was partially muffled, suggesting that perhaps another trucker had arrived during my sleep and I simply hadn't heard the rumble of their engine. While this seemed unlikely given the quiet of the location, I supposed anything was possible. Wanting to verify what I had heard, I reached up and turned on the small overhead light in my sleeping area. The moment that light illuminated, I could clearly hear the sound of shoes slapping against asphalt and someone running away from my truck. As I listened carefully, the footsteps gradually faded as the person moved farther from my location. Whoever had been out there had obviously seen my light activate and had reacted by fleeing the scene. This development immediately put me on high alert. I turned off the light to avoid giving away my exact position within the truck, knowing that as long as the interior remained dark, it would be nearly impossible for anyone outside to see into the depth of the sleeping cab. I used this advantage to carefully survey the parking area through my windows. What I observed was definitely unusual and concerning. An older van was parked across the lot, positioned at an angle so that its broadside faced directly toward my windshield. This was particularly strange because I was absolutely certain that the parking lot had been completely empty when I had arrived earlier that evening. The van's placement seemed deliberately chosen to provide the occupant with a clear view of my truck. I tried to rationalize the situation, telling myself that perhaps the van's occupant had been walking a dog, taking a smoke break, or simply stretching his legs with a few laps around the parking area. Maybe he had accidentally awakened me during his exercise routine, and when he saw my light come on, he realized he had made a mistake and hurried back to his vehicle. For long-haul travelers like ourselves, such activities weren't particularly unusual. Despite these reasonable explanations, I felt a nagging sense of apprehension. Nevertheless, I decided not to investigate further and attempted to return to sleep. Unfortunately, my best efforts to fall back asleep proved unsuccessful. Just as I began to drift off again, I heard those same footsteps returning, followed by what sounded unmistakably like someone attempting to open my passenger side door handle. The distinctive click of the door handle being tested, followed by the slight sway of someone stepping off the truck's sidebar, left no doubt about what was happening. Whoever I had heard coughing earlier was now actively trying to gain entry to my truck. At this point, every alarm in my head was sounding, and the structured, well-planned part of my mind was scrambling to formulate a response to this unprecedented situation. For reasons that many of my friends have criticized me for over the years, I didn't carry a firearm during my trucking runs. I did, however, have a short metal club that I normally used for checking tire pressure, and this seemed like an excellent alternative weapon under the circumstances. I decided that my best course of action was to confront whoever was lurking around the parking lot and make it clear that my truck was private property, not a public facility. Moving swiftly and decisively, I threw open the passenger door and activated my flashlight. I carried a high-quality streamlight that could illuminate objects up to 30 yards away with concentrated white light, not the weak, diffused yellow beam of cheaper alternatives. I swept the beam back and forth across the immediate area, but saw nothing suspicious at first glance. I climbed down from the cab and performed a complete inspection of both the truck and trailer, checking underneath and around every corner. Still, finding nothing, I realized there was only one option remaining. I needed to investigate that van directly. I approached the rear of the vehicle with my flashlight ready, wanting to examine the license plate before proceeding with any further investigation. As I moved to inspect the back bumper and brought my light up to read the plate, my eyes naturally focused on the license plate, which displayed South Dakota registration. However, something else immediately caught my attention and sent a chill down my spine. Near the rear tire, partially hidden behind the vehicle, I could see the toe tips of a pair of boots. Someone was crouched down and hiding on the far side of the van, and only those small portions of their footwear were visible from my position. I kept my light trained on those boot tips for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 20 seconds. It was long enough for the hidden person to realize that their position had been discovered and that they were completely exposed. I watched in fascination and growing dread as the boots slowly shuffled backward until they were completely concealed behind the tire. The sight of this deliberate hiding behavior made my stomach turn sour with apprehension. This person clearly had malicious intentions, and I wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever scheme they were planning. I found myself completely speechless, unable to formulate any kind of verbal challenge or threat. I'm not naturally confrontational, as evidenced by my decision not to carry a firearm, and I didn't want to escalate a situation where someone else might have a significant advantage over me. Instead of confronting the hidden individual, I simply backed away until I reached my truck, climbed inside quickly, and locked all the doors securely. I reasoned that this encounter should be sufficient to discourage further harassment. Both parties now knew exactly what was happening, so the element of mystery had been completely eliminated. This was clearly some vagrant individual looking to make a score, and now that he understood the truck wasn't abandoned, I hoped he would simply move on to easier targets. I sat in my locked cab for 45 minutes, during which time the van never moved. I didn't observe any movement whatsoever, no person, no doors opening or closing, nothing. It was as if whoever was out there was still crouched behind that rear passenger tire, waiting for something. As the night wore on and exhaustion began to overcome my adrenaline, I realized I needed to get at least a couple more hours of rest if I wanted to have a successful driving day ahead. My eyes started to droop despite my vigilance, and eventually I succumbed to sleep once again. The sound that awakened me this time was unmistakably clear, loud, and positioned directly outside my door. It was the sound of a man clearing his throat in that deliberate way people do when they want to get someone's attention. I shot upright and moved cautiously to the window where I could see someone peering over the edge of my door, looking directly into my cab. I froze in place, hoping the darkness would conceal me, but it was obvious that this strategy wasn't working. The person's eyes were moving back and forth systematically, taking in every detail of the interior and searching for whoever was inside. The individual's appearance was deeply unsettling. He looked as though he had given himself a haircut with a butter knife, with some sections completely shaved while others remained long and unkempt. I could see multiple cuts and nicks along his scalp, and it appeared that his eyebrows had been shaved off entirely, though the moonlight made it difficult to be certain of this detail. I could physically feel this person pulling on my door handle, and the force of his efforts was sufficient to make the entire truck rock slightly. Realizing I had to do something, I decided to shout as loudly as possible through the glass. "What do you want?" I hollered, remaining motionless in the back of the cab. I should mention that this conversation was heavily censored in my memory, as I recall using profanity in virtually every sentence I spoke to this individual. His response was simply, "It's me." When I asked who he was, he said, "It's Jake, come on." I realized this might be a case of mistaken identity, so I sat up and reached for my tire pressure club on the floor. "I don't know you," I explained firmly. "I'm not from here. Please, just get away from my truck." The conversation deteriorated rapidly from that point. "Playing hard to get, I like it," he said, with disturbing enthusiasm. "Let's do something different." This individual then launched into a lengthy and explicit monologue about his intentions, none of which involved violence, but all of which were sexual in nature from beginning to end. The scene became increasingly nauseating as I watched this person lick the window of my truck while describing in graphic detail what he wanted to do to me. His fantasies involved worshiping various parts of my body in ways that were both disgusting and terrifying. While I'm not homophobic, the entire situation was deeply disturbing, and I found myself shouting for him to please just leave me alone. His tone began to shift as he continued his monologue, transitioning from describing his desires to explaining what he wanted me to do to him. These new fantasies were much more violent in nature, involving being punched, choked, tied up, and physically abused during sexual encounters. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and the situation continued to escalate as he switched from licking my window to tapping on it, and finally to smashing his fist against the glass. Realizing I had to take some kind of action, I remembered my portable DVD player and formulated a desperate plan. I opened the device and positioned it so that the light from the screen would illuminate my face while keeping the actual source hidden from his view. "I'm calling the police," I announced, hoping the light would appear to be coming from a cell phone or radio. "I've got your South Dakota plates, too." "Richard?" he asked, sounding confused and uncertain for the first time. "I'm not who you're looking for," I replied firmly. "Now get the hell out of here." This was the last thing I ever said to this disturbing individual. I watched him leap down from my truck and begin running in one swift motion. The van's engine immediately fired up, and without even turning on its headlights, it fled from the parking lot at high speed. Honestly, I ended up doing the same thing, and after performing another thorough inspection of my truck and trailer to ensure everything was secure, I rolled out and headed for Livingston. That morning, I seriously considered calling the police to file some kind of report, but ultimately decided it would probably cause more trouble than it was worth. I didn't have the actual license plate number, only that it was a South Dakota van, so I figured my report wouldn't lead anywhere productive. It wasn't until I left the trucking industry that I learned how common this type of encounter actually was, especially after the widespread adoption of Craigslist and similar platforms. Truck stops have always been known for midnight rendezvous, but they became increasingly explicit venues for random hookups all across the country, particularly for traveling men looking to experiment with their sexuality. Whoever that Jake person was, he clearly thought I was someone named Richard, probably another trucker who was supposed to be rolling through Montana that night. Jake must have gotten his locations mixed up, or perhaps Richard was late for their arranged meeting, leading to the case of mistaken identity. Regardless of the specific circumstances, I'm extremely grateful that I had my doors locked that night, as I could very well be telling a completely different and much more tragic story today. The experience reinforced the importance of having a solid plan when traveling, and always sticking to that plan no matter how tempting it might be to deviate from established safety protocols. Story 18, The Dangerous Deception. When I first became a trucker, I harbored many romantic delusions about life on the road. I was a young man when I got behind the wheel for the first time, and frankly, I didn't know much about anything beyond the basics of operating a commercial vehicle. Fortunately, the trucking industry is filled with gruff, experienced, older drivers who have already made every possible mistake and are usually quite vocal about sharing their hard-earned wisdom. Whenever I stopped for coffee or simply used the restroom at a truck stop, some weathered veteran would inevitably have an earful of advice for me. They would lecture me about planning better routes, driving more efficiently, managing my time more effectively, improving my wheel handling technique, and countless other aspects of the profession. While this constant stream of unsolicited advice was often annoying, occasionally there would be genuinely useful tips and tricks that could help get me out of serious trouble. This particular story is about making a significant mistake, getting myself into a dangerous situation, and using my wits combined with that accumulated wisdom from older drivers to escape unharmed. I prefer not to reveal too much personal information, so I won't specify exactly which state this incident occurred in. I'll simply say that it happened somewhere in the northern United States, parallel with the Canadian border, which plays an important factor in the events that unfolded. It was late afternoon when I found myself navigating through a small township with a population of approximately 11,000 residents. The interstate highway curved directly through this community, as it does with many small towns across America, keeping them connected to the broader economic network. Towns like these often function almost like truck stops themselves, with drivers catching sleep at information centers, gas stations at the town limits, or sometimes just in the local Walmart parking lot. These communities can be incredibly convenient for truckers, but they can also be frustrating depending on the timing of your arrival. There's nothing quite like hitting a small town during the single hour of rush hour traffic when you just happen to be rolling through, turning a simple transit into a lengthy delay. I had just cleared the town limits when I spotted someone standing alongside the road with their thumb extended in the classic hitchhiker's pose. The sun was beginning to set, and I could see that the person was wearing denim cut-off shorts. The temperature was already around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but once the sun disappeared completely, it would plummet to approximately 25 degrees, well below freezing, and this individual didn't appear to be wearing any kind of coat or jacket. Immediately, I could hear the voices of 1,000 different veteran truckers shouting warnings in my head. "Do not pick her up," they seemed to say in unison. "Never pick up a hitchhiker." I remember a buddy of mine picked up a guy once and the man wouldn't get out of the cab. They're all drug addicts or mentally unstable. They'll steal your belongings and leave you stranded on the side of the highway. No matter how bored, lonely, or desperate you get, never pick up these people. Despite all this accumulated wisdom echoing in my mind, I applied the brakes and pulled on to the shoulder, watching as she walked toward my passenger door. I realized immediately that this decision might have been a mistake. The person I had spotted was much younger than I had initially estimated. She had looked about 20 years old in the fading sunlight, but now that she was closer, she appeared to be perhaps 16 years old. Regardless of her age, I wasn't a dangerous person or someone with malicious intentions. But now I found myself confused about what this young woman was doing in such a remote location. I maintained my guard as I rolled down the window to speak with her, preparing myself for whatever story she might tell. She turned out to be remarkably pleasant and polite. She introduced herself as Katie and explained that she simply needed transportation to the next town over. Her story involved coming to this area with friends and somehow getting separated from them, leaving her uncertain about their current whereabouts. According to Katie, the original plan had been for the group to return to their hometown, which was approximately an hour's drive away, so she had walked to the edge of town and waited for them to pass by. As the day progressed and she didn't see her friend's vehicle drive past, she began to suspect that she had missed them somehow, so she decided to try hitchhiking to catch up with them. The story was almost believable, but certain elements seemed fabricated, or at least suspicious to me. When I asked why she hadn't used a payphone or tried to call home for assistance, she explained that her parents were unaware of her trip to the neighboring town and that she would be in serious trouble if they discovered she had traveled so far from home. At this point, I simply wanted to get back on the road and continue my journey, so I made the critical mistake of telling her to climb into the cab. For the next 15 minutes or so, she proved to be excellent company, asking numerous questions about the truck, my job, and the cargo I was hauling in the trailer. She seemed like an honest, bright, and curious high school student, and had I known her true identity and intentions, I would have left her exactly where I found her. I agreed to drop her off in the next town, whatever that might entail. As we continued our conversation, the sun nearly disappeared completely, and we found ourselves driving through the treacherous twilight hours. This is widely considered the most dangerous time to drive, as twilight plays tricks with your vision, making shadows longer and deeper and causing people to see whatever their imagination conjures up. Every experienced trucker can tell you stories about the deceptions of the twilight hour. I was maintaining a steady speed when Katie suddenly sat upright and pointed ahead of us, asking, "What is that?" I leaned forward and began to apply the brakes, but initially I couldn't see anything unusual. Only after we had traveled another 100 feet or so did something appear in the roadway ahead of us. I pressed harder on the brakes and squinted over the steering wheel, trying to identify what I was seeing. There were unmistakably 3 people lying in a line across both lanes of the interstate highway. My heart began racing as my mind scrambled to process what I was witnessing. I assumed I had come upon a serious accident, perhaps people who had fallen from the back of a truck and hadn't been noticed by the driver. I was completely certain that I had discovered a multiple fatality and would need to call it in to authorities immediately. Then I looked over at Katie and noticed that she had developed a strange little grin on her face, which disappeared the moment we made eye contact. This observation immediately triggered alarm bells in my mind. I pulled onto the shoulder to avoid running over these people any more than they might have been already, but as I looked out my side window to assess the situation, they all appeared to be intact. One of them even seemed to be moving slightly and looking back up at me. Once again, the accumulated wisdom of veteran drivers began echoing in my memory. People get desperate and will do all kinds of crazy things to make you stop, they had warned me repeatedly. They'll stand in the road just to force you to stop if they have to. If you see someone in the dark doing something weird like sitting, crawling, or lying down, you never stop. If you do, they're going to hurt you. Someone willing to stand in the road is so desperate they have nothing to lose. I remembered some of the horrifying stories I had heard at diners and truck stops about small groups of stranded people developing elaborate schemes to stop traffic, and lying in the roadway was definitely one of those methods. This wasn't simple hitchhiking anymore. These people represented a far more dangerous level of desperation and criminal intent. Everything suddenly clicked into place in my mind, and instead of stopping to render aid, I shifted gears and rumbled directly past the prone figures into the darkness ahead. I could see Katie's entire demeanor change immediately and dramatically. "Why aren't you stopping?" she demanded, her voice taking on a sharp, accusatory tone that was completely different from her previous, pleasant manner. "Because there's nothing actually wrong with them," I replied firmly. "What do you mean?" "They looked like they got run over," she protested, but her protest sounded rehearsed and artificial. "No, they looked like they were setting a trap for me," I explained. "I'll call this into dispatch and let the authorities know what's happening here." "No!" she screamed, and actually tried to knock my hand away from the radio receiver. Now, I was absolutely certain that she knew exactly who those people were, and that this was all part of some elaborate criminal scheme. This girl was a central participant in whatever racket was being run, and my good intentions had gotten me caught up in their illegal activities. I felt incredibly grateful that she was a small teenager rather than a large adult male accomplice. "Well, we can call them when we get to the next town," I suggested, trying to sound reasonable. "The police back there are always busy anyway." Now she was offering excuses and alternatives, trying to delay any contact with law enforcement. Things were becoming stranger and more suspicious by the minute, and I found myself staring at the clock, counting down every second until we reached the next town. I was trying to decide whether I should simply kick her out of my truck or take the time to report her activities and get everything officially documented. My decision was made for me when I spotted a police checkpoint ahead, positioned just 5 miles outside the town we were approaching. The girl immediately hunched down and looked toward the back where my sleeping area was located. She asked nervously if it would be okay if she hid because police officers made her nervous or something similar. I told her it wouldn't do any good because I was planning to report her anyway, along with her friends or whoever those people had been lying in the road behind us. I stopped where the police officers directed me and rolled down my window to speak with them. The officers already had some basic information about who I was and what was happening. They asked if I had picked up a hitchhiker that evening, and I confirmed that I had. They asked if the hitchhiker was a young woman, and again I answered affirmatively, explaining that she was sitting right next to me in the cab. They inquired whether I knew her personally, and I said no, explaining that I had only picked her up because the sun was setting. I had initially thought she was an adult, and upon realizing she was just a kid, I felt compelled to get her out of the cold. I admitted that I hadn't fully understood the gravity of the situation when I made that decision. The officers then provided me with information that completely explained everything that had transpired. It turned out that Katie's real name was Corey, and she and several of her friends had escaped from a local residential facility. This wasn't just any school. It was more like a juvenile detention center than a traditional educational institution. Problem children were sent there, young criminals were placed there to avoid jail time, and it also housed tough foster children and kids that families simply couldn't handle anymore. This was where rural communities could send their wards of the state or children that had become completely unmanageable. The proof of the facility's purpose was evident in the backgrounds of its residents. These girls had extensive histories of violence, not just against other children at the detention center, but against teachers, counselors, and other authority figures as well. Previous escape attempts had involved stealing cars, breaking into houses, and generally creating chaos and destruction throughout the surrounding communities. This particular escape was one of the most organized and sophisticated that the facility had ever experienced, and Corey had been the mastermind behind the entire operation. According to the officers, the girls had stolen a set of keys, created an elaborate distraction, and one by one slipped out into the night. 6 girls had escaped in total, including Corey. There were 2 more hiding in the immediate vicinity, and 3 who had been lying in the road, just as I had suspected. The plan, as I understood it, was for them to force a vehicle to stop, with Corey encouraging the driver to pull over and render assistance, and then all 6 girls would assault whoever was unfortunate enough to fall for their scheme. They intended to beat their victims severely and steal their vehicle, leaving them stranded and potentially seriously injured. However, the accumulated wisdom of veteran truckers had saved me from this fate. Their repeated warnings about never stopping for people staging incidents on roadways had proven invaluable, and Corey's inability to maintain her innocent facade had alerted me that something was seriously wrong with the entire situation. She turned on me instantly when the officers began to remove her from my truck, shouting a stream of insults, denying everything, and claiming to be a girl named Katie. The officers opened the passenger door and began coaxing her out, and from the sound of their interaction, they had already apprehended her accomplices and had them in custody. The situation wasn't necessarily going to result in serious legal consequences for the girls, since they were already enrolled in a state program designed to deal with exactly these types of behavioral issues. The primary concerns were their safety and ensuring that all of them were accounted for and returned to secure custody. However, these girls had a history of previous escapes and a wide range of criminal activities, including vandalism, assault, robbery, and arson. Only after the officers placed Corey in handcuffs and began putting her into a patrol car did her carefully constructed persona completely collapse. She began screaming about how she wasn't going back to the facility, how the staff members weren't her parents, and unleashing all sorts of dramatic protests. She transformed from a composed, calculating escape artist to a screaming child in approximately 5 seconds. Witnessing this transformation was actually sobering and made me feel somewhat better about the entire situation, as it reminded me that despite her criminal sophistication, she was still fundamentally a troubled kid. Unfortunately for me, this incident resulted in extensive questioning by law enforcement. I probably don't need to explain how suspicious it appeared for a male trucker to be found with an underage girl while attempting to transport her out of town. Only after I provided a detailed explanation of my reasoning that she appeared to be without adequate clothing for the dropping temperatures and all the other logical factors I had considered did they begin to give me some room to breathe. I explained the attempt to force me to stop and steal my truck, my realization that Corey was operating some kind of criminal scheme, and how all the pieces had fallen into place once I understood what was really happening. We compared notes and reached the same conclusion about what had been planned. The investigation revealed that these girls had simply been planning an elaborate escape, and I had been the first driver to stop for Corey's hitchhiking. She confirmed that there hadn't been any sexual component to their plan, which was excellent news for me legally. I don't think she realized at the time that she could have seriously damaged my life and reputation with just one false accusation. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and after thorough questioning and documentation, I was permitted to continue my journey. You can be absolutely certain that I never picked up another hitchhiker after that encounter, regardless of how cold the weather was or how inadequately dressed they appeared to be. That experience provided me with perfect perspective on every piece of advice those veteran drivers had shared with me over the years. It only takes one encounter with truly dangerous people to understand why the experienced truckers had developed such strict rules about these situations. The road has a way of eventually exposing every driver to the weird and dangerous elements of society, and preparation through accumulated wisdom can literally be a matter of life and death. Years have passed since this incident occurred, and now I find myself in the position of being one of those grizzled veterans who lectures younger drivers every time I stop for coffee. The cycle continues, and I hope that my stories and warnings will help some young trucker avoid the mistakes and dangers that I encountered during my time on the road. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that good intentions, while admirable, must always be balanced with practical safety considerations. The road is full of people who will exploit kindness and generosity for criminal purposes, and maintaining appropriate caution and skepticism can prevent a helpful gesture from becoming a life-threatening situation. Sometimes the difference between a good deed and a serious mistake is nothing more than the accumulated wisdom of those who have traveled these roads before us and lived to share their stories with the next generation of drivers. The Story 19. There are industrial facilities scattered across America's landscape that operate in the gray zones between civilization and wilderness. Places where legitimate business requires access to remote locations, far from the comfort of populated areas. These facilities often operate around the clock, but their isolation makes them islands of artificial light in seas of natural darkness. It was to such a facility near Reno, Nevada, that our trucker found himself dispatched for an early morning delivery. The location was miles off the main highway, reached by a series of increasingly narrow roads that seemed to lead deeper into country that maps marked as empty space. By the time he reached his destination, the lights of Reno were just a distant glow on the horizon, like a memory of civilization viewed from another planet. The facility was locked up tight at 1 in the morning, which was not unusual for operations that relied on automated systems and remote monitoring. A few security lights cast weak pools of illumination across empty parking lots and loading docks, but the overall impression was of a place temporarily abandoned by human presence. Our trucker had delivered to similar locations hundreds of times. The routine was familiar. Park in a designated area, catch a few hours of sleep in the sleeper cab, then complete the delivery when staff arrived in the morning. He chose a spot away from the main buildings, killed his engine, and settled into his bunk with the satisfaction of a man who had found the perfect place to rest before completing his assignment. The facility's isolation was actually a blessing. No traffic noise, no city lights bleeding through his curtains, just the profound quiet that comes with being truly alone in the wilderness. He closed his eyes and let the familiar sounds of his truck cooling down lull him towards sleep. But sleep would not come easily that night. The first knock came around 2 in the morning, jolting him from the edge of unconsciousness with the violent urgency of someone demanding immediate attention. It rattled his entire truck, as if someone were pounding on his door with both fists, using enough force to rock the vehicle on its suspension. His mind snapped to full alertness, adrenaline flooding his system as he tried to process what he'd heard. The knock had been unmistakably deliberate. Not the random impact of wind-blown debris or settling metal, but the purposeful action of someone who knew he was inside and wanted him to know they were outside. Then it came again, even louder and more insistent than before. The sound seemed to penetrate the steel walls of his cab like a physical force, carrying implications of barely controlled violence. It was the kind of knocking that said, "I know you're in there, and I'm not going away." Heart hammering against his ribs, the trucker fumbled for his door handle. His hands felt clumsy and unresponsive, as if his nervous system was struggling to coordinate movement with thought. Every instinct screamed at him to remain hidden, but logic demanded that he investigate the source of the disturbance. He yanked open his door and leaned out into the night, eyes scanning the area around his truck with desperate intensity. The security lights revealed nothing. No figure crouched by his cab, no vehicle parked nearby, no sign of human presence anywhere within the reach of artificial illumination. The facility's parking lot stretched away into darkness, empty and silent as a graveyard. No movement disturbed the shadows between buildings. No sound broke the absolute quiet that had settled over the location like a suffocating blanket. Had he imagined it? The knocking had seemed so real, so immediate, that his truck still seemed to vibrate with its impact. But the evidence of his senses suggested otherwise. He was alone, in a place where being alone should have been impossible. He climbed down from his cab and walked the perimeter of his truck, boots crunching against gravel that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. He checked under the trailer, scanned the shadows between his truck and the nearby buildings, looked for any sign that someone had been attempting to gain access to his vehicle. Nothing. No footprints in the dust, no disturbed gravel, no evidence that anyone had been near his truck since he'd parked it hours earlier. The security lights continued their futile vigil over empty spaces, and the facility's buildings remained as dark and uninhabited as crypts. But as he stood there in the Nevada darkness, a new kind of silence settled around him, not the peaceful quiet of remote places, but the oppressive hush that comes when everything that should be making noise suddenly stops. No wind stirred the desert brush, no distant highway sounds carried across the emptiness, no electronic hum came from the facility's equipment. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that hadn't yet revealed itself. The trucker didn't wait to find out what that something might be. Every primitive alarm his species had developed over millions of years of avoiding predators was now screaming at maximum volume. He bolted back to his truck, locked the doors, and fired up the engine with hands that shook so violently he could barely grip the key. He didn't stop driving until he found a truck stop populated with other drivers, other human beings going about their normal routines under bright artificial lights. Only then did he allow himself to consider what might have happened in that remote parking lot. Had the knocking been real? His truck had certainly shaken with its impact, and the sound had been too specific, too purposeful to dismiss his imagination. But if someone had been attempting to gain access to his vehicle, where had they gone? And why had they vanished so completely when he investigated? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he'd narrowly escaped something that his conscious mind couldn't fully process. The facility was too remote for random crime, too isolated for casual harassment. Whatever had wanted his attention that night had been operating with purpose and intelligence, following patterns that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic mischief. He never returned to that facility after dark, and in subsequent conversations with other drivers, he learned that he wasn't the first to experience strange encounters at remote delivery locations. The trucking industry was full of stories about places where normal rules seemed suspended, where isolation created opportunities for things that preferred to avoid the scrutiny of populated areas. Some drivers theorized about criminal gangs that targeted truckers in remote locations, using psychological warfare to disorient their victims before moving in for robbery or worse. Others spoke of corporate security systems that malfunctioned in ways that created false alarms and phantom encounters. But our trucker had his own theory. one that he kept to himself because it sounded too much like the plot of a horror movie to share with practical men who dealt in freight schedules and fuel economy. He believed that some places exist at the intersection of civilization and wilderness, territories where human presence is tolerated rather than welcomed, where things that prefer darkness gather to investigate the strange metal creatures that occasionally invade their domain. The facility near Reno continues to operate, continues to receive deliveries from drivers who park in that same remote lot and sleep in their cabs while waiting for morning shifts to arrive. But some of those drivers now report strange dreams, unusual sounds, and the persistent feeling that they're being watched by eyes that reflect no light and leave no tracks in the dust. Because in America's most isolated places, where security lights create small islands of artificial day in oceans of natural night, the boundary between the known and unknown becomes permeable. Things that avoid populated areas find perfect hunting grounds among the industrial facilities and remote operations that keep modern society functioning. And sometimes they announce their presence with sounds that carry messages no human language can translate. The knocking continues, patient and persistent, waiting for travelers who venture too far from the safety of crowds, who dare to sleep alone in places where sleep makes them vulnerable to attention they never wanted and encounters they are not equipped to survive.